This is supposedly research ethics. We'll find out if that actually turns out to be the case. I don't know. I haven't really looked at the slides. I'll start going and it'll just go, oh wow, that's what we're talking about. Yeah. We're going to be here for about 17 hours, so I hope that's okay with you. Okay? I'll try to make the first 15 as painless as possible. Last 2, sorry, you're just going to have to suck it up on those. All right. I'm actually only one of your instructors. There are 2 of us. I'll do the first 2 hours. And then Ms. Leah Eisenberg, there back in the back corner, who's calling you all wimps. And don't forget what she called you, all right? She will take the last 2 hours.
They can come taunt me in the summer when I'm laying on the ground crying.
That's right. That's right. It's too hot. All right. So, let's see. Anything I want to say before we get going, aside from settling in for 15 hours? Nope, I think we're good. Please do ask questions, make comments along the way. While there's tons of slides, and it seems very formal because, gosh, I worked so hard on putting these slides together. The fact of the matter is that all that formality is just supposed to be an opportunity for us to converse if that's important to you. Otherwise, take notes, take a nap. I won't know. Right? I'm just be talking the whole time. Right. So.
One quick housekeeping. I have SOCR certificates for the end of the lecture.
you got to suffer through all 622 hours before you get those certificates. Okay, just so you know. So, what we're going to do is we're going to get into research ethics through a kind of historical account. Now, look. Some of you will know parts of this history, if not all of it. Some of you won't at all. But there's a reason for going historically, and it's because we are ultimately in the wake of this history. That is, where we work, how we're supposed to operate in our daily practice of research is guided by, is governed by the history that we came through, at least in the 20th century. The types of rules and regulations that exist and the concerns that we'll be talking about come directly out of this history. So that's why we're going to start historically, so that you can see the context that you're situated in as a research professional. So, here are some of the 20th century landmarks we're going to look at: Nuremberg, Helsinki, Beecher, Tuskegee, the National Commission, and the Common Rule. So that's going to be the first 14 hours, okay? All right, it takes a long time to talk about. History is a long time. I mean, think about that. That's 60 years. I'm going to do it in 14 hours. You should be happy, right? You could have lived all 60 years of those at that time. I mean, at least I'm not making you do that, right? Right? You're welcome. All right. So, look, the history of research and research ethics certainly predates the 20th century, but it really gets a special focus and becomes codified, written down, concerning and systematized in the middle of the 20th century. So we all know that at the end of World War II, there were a series of trials in Nuremberg, Germany, and they were trials taking the leaders of the Third Reich and putting them before a panel of judges. And one set of trials were for the military leaders of the Third Reich for crimes against humanity. And there was a second set of trials, and they were for the medical, research, scientific personnel that worked in the Third Reich, also for crimes against humanity. And it was from that trial that a panel of 7 judges, really lawyers primarily from the United States, came up with what we now call the Nuremberg Code. It was in their final statement from the court at the end that they codified 10 principles that we call the Nuremberg Code. Now, I can count as well as you. Those aren't 10, all right? Right. I say, what, 10, right? No, those aren't 10. I don't care about the other 5. They suck. No, I'm just kidding. The point is, these are just kind of the highlight points, all right, that the code has. So, for example, they insisted that participants in research must give voluntary consent. There must be volunteers. They must freely accept to be part of research, right? And you can understand, given the atrocities of Nazi Germany, why you might have such a rule, right? I mean, all of those people were, you might say, conscripted, right? That's a nice word, right? But here, voluntary. That they should at least attempt to yield fruitful results. That is, we should try to do something good out of all of this. Not just, well, gosh, I wonder if it would be interesting to find out how it feels to get stuck in the eye with a stick. You want to find out? Let's do the research, right? I think it's going to hurt. Probably hurt, right? So, yielding fruitful results, kind of important. Prior animal studies. Now, PETA doesn't like this one. And understandably so, we don't do nice things to some of our animals. But at the same time, if you really think about it, there are some things you want to test out in some other environment before we start shoving them into human beings. Risks should not exceed the potential promise, so even if there's a potential for fruitful results, the risks shouldn't be so great that they overbalance those potential good things. And then being volunteers, right? Being voluntary, they could withdraw at any time. Now, again, there's some other principles, but these are some of the highlights here. Now, this sounds very good. Makes a lot of sense, but a couple of things. First off, this is 1947-48 when this comes out. And it's a panel of judges sitting in judgment of Nazi medical personnel. And so at some point, the research establishment, the medical establishment, wants to kind of take ownership of these principles, of the concept of research ethics. So come 1964, the World Medical Association comes together and determines its own set of research ethics principles. They call it the Declaration of Helsinki. It has since been updated over and over again, but they make some important changes. They start from Nuremberg. They think it's a good base, but it needs, you might say, some fleshing out and some annotation, right? Something a little bit more robust. So it's very nice of you to join us. You know, I saved the best part for when you got here. No, I'm just kidding. Don't listen to me. Don't worry about it. All right, so for example, it's nice that potential benefits should outweigh risks, right? We already saw that with Nuremberg. But what Helsinki did was go a next step and say, those risks must be manageable. So in our day and age, what do we insist on? A management plan, right? Data management plan, those kinds of things, where you can say, look, if things go out of control, what's going to happen? Who's going to be overseeing this? How are we going to know? Because otherwise, they could just go out of control, right? So we're going to go the next step with Helsinki. It's going to be more than just benefits over risks. Risks have to be manageable, okay? And we're going to go another step with those volunteers. Anybody ever watch those, once in a while it's on TV, you'll see some guy who's a hypnotist and he calls somebody up on stage or something like that and hypnotizes them and they become a chicken, right? There you go, see? There it is, right? Becomes a chicken. Now, when I see that, I don't know about you, when you see that, do you want to volunteer? See, you say, I don't want to be a chicken. Thank you very much. Don't want to be a chicken. So what's the difference between the first person who's willing to volunteer and the second person who isn't? What's the difference between those two? Information, right? In the first instance, you can get any schmo to volunteer. I mean, we're all fools. We'll kind of say, yeah, sure, hey, it might be a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow. And then we find out not so much. The information helps you process and determine, is this something I really want to do? And while I'm sure the folks at Nuremberg were not particularly opposed to information, they didn't really set it up in their codification. When they wrote out the code, they didn't really make it explicit. And the Declaration of Helsinki does. It says, look, it's not just voluntary consent that matters. It's being well informed so you can make an intelligent decision that matches with your interests and values, right? And it goes further than that. So to respect those participants, those volunteers, not only must we inform them, we need to make sure that their privacy is protected. And then they took a step that actually bothered many people. They said, you know what? You can also gain consent from someone else. Legal guardian, somebody like that. Now, first off, why would they say that? Why might the World Medical Association think that's a good thing? This is the interactive part of the session, just so we all know. Okay. So what? So right, in your case, right, how would you get children into a research study? Well, they could volunteer and consent for themselves. No, right? We don't typically believe that children have the capacity to make these kind of high-end decisions. So if that's true, how could they voluntarily and intelligently consent? If they couldn't voluntarily and intelligently consent, then they wouldn't be allowed into the trial, at least according to Nuremberg. Now, the key to Nuremberg was that the individual participant has to be the one who says yes. That was the wedge in any slippery slope. That's what Nuremberg was trying to stop, was it's spinning out of control. But the World Medical Association said, look, there's going to be whole cohorts of individuals who can't be part of research, and therefore we won't learn something, right? Research is about learning. We need to learn about kids. We need to learn about the mentally disabled, right? What about dementia research, right? High-end dementia research, how would that get done if the participants are in the full throes of dementia? So the World Medical Association said, no, we've got to broaden this. A legal guardian should be allowed to consent, or we now say give permission for these people to be part of the process. Okay? So all of this grows. Now, tell me something. This is the geography part of the exam, okay? Where are Nuremberg and Helsinki? Broad categories will work. Nuremberg is in Germany. Look, you can be really broad. The other side of the ocean will work for me, okay? All right? All right? Europe, right? Helsinki, Finland, by the way. But so the other thing is over there, right? So you get something like this. The Nuremberg Code was conceived in reference to Nazi atrocities and was written for the specific purposes of preventing brutal excesses from being committed or excused in the name of science. The code is, in our opinion, not necessarily pertinent to or adequate for the conduct of medical research in the United States. Joseph Gardello was on a committee at Harvard that was looking specifically at issues in research ethics. And as chair of that committee, this was the statement that came out in 1962, saying, look, Code Schmoes, Nuremberg, those wretched Nazis. We aren't wretched Nazis. We're good, righteous Americans, right? This stuff doesn't apply to the stuff we're doing here. This was exactly the same time that they are working on the Declaration of Helsinki. All right? And none of this seemed to matter to folks like Gardella. There were other issues that were pertinent to the United States that just what coming out in these codes. Well, there was a man on that committee, very famous man. His name was Henry Beecher. Henry Beecher was an MD researcher, very well known in pain studies and things like that. He was anesthesiology was his background. Well known in pain studies. Beecher completely disagreed with Gardella on this. The two of them kind of sat at the opposite ends of the committee table and fought about this a lot. In fact, Beecher bought hook, line, and sinker Nuremberg. He just believed Nuremberg Code got it right. And so as this committee was winding up, Beecher got an idea. He decided he was going to look at 10 years worth of published research in the United States from peer-reviewed journals. He was going to look at the published research, exactly what was published. He wasn't going to go and do any further investigation. Just look at what people published in peer-reviewed journals. And he was going to see if he could identify through those publications any violations of Nuremberg. And he said he found them by the dozens. Found them by the dozens. And in 1966, he published a famous article in the New England Journal of Medicine called Ethics in Clinical Research. And that article, of those dozens and dozens, he culled down to 22. And he published 22 incidents of violations, of research ethics violations that were reported in the literature. That is, they weren't reported as violations. They were reported as protocol and practice. And he said, nope, this violates something. Nope, this is wrong, so on and so forth. And so you get things like, of course, that's not, I know that's not 22 as well, just so I just want you to know I know my numbers a little. All right, but you know, he found things like injecting cancer cells into non-consenting elderly adults. That was what we now know as the Jewish chronic hospital experiments. Exposing institutionalized children to hepatitis. That's a practice we now associate with an institution now closed called Willowbrook. No therapy control groups in serious treatable diseases. That was rampant in many situations, and so on and so forth. So he had identified these things. He did not, in fact, identify the actual research or the people who did it. People have gone back since and figured it out, right? Oh, he gave us enough clues, and you know, historians like to piece that stuff together. So we know what they were, but he wasn't trying to call out individuals. He was trying to say, no, it does apply here. Gardella's wrong. It applies here in the United States. So David Rothman is a medical historian at Columbia, and he wrote a book called Strangers at the Bedside. It's a very nice readable book about the growth, the rise of bioethics, something I supposedly do, bioethics in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. It's a historical account, very nice read. And the chapter on Beecher's account is called the Watershed Era, okay? Because for Rothman, it's this, an insider calling the practice to task in the most important journal for medicine and research in the country. That was the moment that changed the game, according to Rothman. And I think he's right insofar as the 60s and that era and things like this are the watershed era. But honestly, I think it's Tuskegee. And I'll tell you why. So how many have heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study? Okay. So let's go through it very quickly. Tuskegee syphilis study had 600 participants in Macon County, Georgia, started in 1932. Okay? 1932. Anybody know what was happening in 1932? Depression, right. Anybody know where Macon County, Alabama is? I do. I take it you haven't been to Macon County, Alabama. So Auburn University, very near Macon County, Alabama. It is down in the central, almost southeast corner of Alabama. It is still to this day one of the poorest counties in that state, and it's that state, like Arkansas and many of the southern states, are some of the poorest states, right? They picked Macon County, Alabama for 3 reasons. They being the Public Health Service. Should be clear on that. Public Health Service was running this, a government agency. They picked it for 3 reasons. 1, because there was supposedly a high incidence of syphilis in the area. 2, because Tuskegee University was there and thus gave an academic base for this to occur. And 3, African American population readily available. Well, why would those things matter? Because the purpose of the study was to follow the life course of syphilis, to follow it all the way through, to see what it did to people from beginning to end, or at least from middle to end. To watch the life of syphilis through these individuals. But why African Americans? Well, there's some very interesting background on this, and if you ever want to see some of it, you can read Bad Blood by James Jones, historian actually grew up in Arkansas, or Tuskegee's Truths by Susan Reverby. Excellent books, great way of getting some more background on this. But some of the background is, the purported reason is we've done the studies in Northern Europe back in the early 1900s, and we followed the life course of syphilis in Northern Europeans. So now we need to study it in African American population. But the rationale was a highly sexualized, highly racially motivated rationale when you start looking back at the paperwork, when you look at the letters sent back and forth. The fact that African Americans are a more sexual breed and so on and so forth is the kind of language that's being used, right? It's a very scary, racially charged language that's part of the background of all of this. But you're also in a very poor area, so that when you volunteered, you could get a free lunch whenever it was time to see the research personnel. You could get supposed health checks. Those health checks could include things like a spinal tap. You get transportation so that a car would come and pick you up and drive you back and forth as necessary. And they were never told they had bad blood, that they had syphilis. They were told they had bad blood. Now, there have been interviews of some of the research personnel and some of the participants from Tuskegee. And the research personnel say, well, we use the term bad blood because we understood that to be a euphemism for syphilis in the African American community. But when you talk to the participants, they said, well, I don't think, I didn't have syphilis, bad blood. Now, that's 1932 when it starts. Tuskegee study goes from 1932 to 1942. 1928, Alexander Fleming, as the legend goes, leaves a petri dish on a window, comes back the next week, and penicillin's discovered. Okay? Now, it doesn't actually become a drug for another 10 years. it takes that long to isolate and turn it into a usable drug form. But by the early 1940s, penicillin is now available, particularly to military personnel during World War II. All of these men were systematically kept out of the military. They were kept out of the military because they would get a physical that would have identified they had syphilis, which means they would have to be pulled from the study because they would have gotten treatment. So they're kept out. So 1942. By 1952, World War II is over and penicillin is now available as a prescription drug. But none of them are allowed to go and see physicians other than those who are running the study. 1952, 1962. 1962 leads ultimately to 1972. And in 1972, the study finally ends. And the reason it ends is because a man named Peter Buxton, who worked for the Public Health Service in the 1960s, finally leaves the Public Health Service. And during his time in the Public Health Service, he had learned about the Tuskegee study, was not happy with it at all. He kept telling his superiors, we need to look at this and we need to do something about this. This study does not seem right. But every time a panel would be convened in order to look at the study, they always stamped its approval and it moved on. So Peter Buxton, now no longer part of the Public Health Service, goes to a reporter, an Associated Press reporter named Gene Heller, and tells the story of Tuskegee. And that story gets published in the Washington Star newspaper. Washington Star newspaper is published in what city? It's in the title. Washington, right? D.C., which happens to have a lot of people in the federal government running around it. All right? You can kind of see them on the street. You can go, oh, there's one, right? All sorts of federal government people. And so this hits Congress. And a man named Senator Ted Kennedy sees this and says, we need to have federal hearings on this. And it's the federal hearings that shut down Tuskegee. So Tuskegee has things like this. Here's your Macon County Health Department flyer. Dear sir, some time ago you were given a thorough examination, and since that time we hope you've gotten a great deal of treatment for bad blood. You will now be given your last chance to get a second examination. This examination is a very special one, and after it is finished, you will be given a special treatment if it is believed you are in condition to stand it. Remember, this is your last chance for special free treatment. Be sure to meet the nurse. Anything strike you in this particular flyer? This notice? No? Well, hopefully by the end of the second hour it will. Okay? All right. We'll save that. All right? Somebody hold on to that. And then by 72, when this is now all in public sphere, people are talking about it. It ends up in newspapers and in political cartoons. Now, why I say Tuskegee is the watershed moment is because while Beecher's article is very important within the research community, it's Tuskegee that makes research ethics a national federal conversation, because it's out of that hearings occur. And it's out of those hearings that is created what's called the National Commission. It's actually the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. We just call it the National Commission because the rest of us can't remember the rest of that stuff, right? So the National Commission is created in 1974, and it's charged with looking at research and coming up with ethical principles for acceptable federal research. That's what it's charged with doing. And the commission is made up of healthcare researchers, physicians, clergy, strangely enough, philosophers, and other things like that, all in a group to think about what are the proper principles that should guide ethical research that's federally funded. And in 1978-79, they bring this all together in what is now known as the Belmont Report. Anybody know why it's called the Belmont Report? It's really an important reason. You should know this. I mean, this is the single most important thing you're going to learn today, because they finished their deliberations in the Belmont Hotel. Really, that's it. There you go. Is that a reason to name something or what? That is really spot on. All right, so the Belmont Report comes out. Now, the Belmont Report does some really important things. First off, it identifies 3 types of healthcare, health science activities. I'll use that term. It talks about therapeutic practice, that is, clinical care. It talks about innovation or experimentation, by which they do not mean research. They mean those clinical practices that you do to help a patient out. Maybe it's a new surgical technique or something like that, where you're trying it for the first time, but you're trying it for this particular patient. And then research. And the reason they make these definitions and stratify these different types of activities is their report is about the last one. That is, the ethical principles they're identifying are for the practice or the activity of research. And so they have to define research. We'll get to that definition in a minute. Out of that, once they've identified their subject matter, then they turn to the question at hand. What are the prescriptive judgments? What are the principles that will guide ethical research? And they say there are 3: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. They say these are the 3 basic principles that should guide all research ethically. And they are kind enough to take it a step further and say, we're not just going to leave you with these 3 principles, we're going to show you what we mean in application, how those principles get applied. Respect for persons, its on-the-ground application is primarily about informed consent. Right? You respect people by gaining their informed consent. Beneficence. You meet the principle of beneficence when you weigh harms and benefits, and they weigh out towards the beneficial, right? There's more benefits than harm. But you look at your protocol, you develop your practices in such a way that you're weighing harms and benefits as you go through, and you make sure that they weigh towards the beneficial. 3, justice. And this is the one that doesn't quite get enough play, but it's actually the one that drove the Belmont Report in the first place. It was the concern that we are unduly, unacceptably using vulnerable populations and burdening them with our research practices for the benefit of others. And so justice, they say in application, is about being very sensitive to subject selection. Who is it that you're targeting and sampling through this whole thing? It also recommends things like what eventually become IRBs. There's more to the report. It's online. It's a federal report, so you can see it online if you ever want to. Now, why should I tell you about a report that is now 37 years old, 30, whatever it is? Why should that matter? I mean, the federal government moves on. Research certainly has moved on since that time. Why would it matter to you today? It's a very interactive group. I mean, I'm glad that I can ask the questions and answer them myself. This is, you don't get to answer. We
still have to meet those requirements.
Okay, why do we have to meet those requirements? You say we still have to, why?
Well, I have to both morally and also legally. I mean, that's part of our requirement when we perform research is to get informed consent, make sure the subject knows the harms and benefits.
But you might say those are the applications. You know, the principles could have fallen away by now, right? We could say, all right, we identified the principles, but now regulations and laws take care of codifying the principles and telling us, yes, we have to get informed consent. It's the law, right? Here's why. I mean, you're on the right track. Here's why. A, if they are right, those principles would still hold. That is, the change in practices wouldn't necessarily invalidate the principles that they've identified, right? Those, whether or not they're universal and for all times, I don't know, but they certainly, in the last 38 years, the practices of research haven't changed so much that those three principles don't still apply. We should still respect persons. We should still care about beneficence, and justice still matters, right? Plato actually worried about justice too. He wrote a whole book called Republic about it, right? So, I mean, these are kind of long-standing moral norms that matter. But you're getting to it in the second part as well. You are required to follow not just the applications, but the principles themselves. This institution, as does many across the United States, signs on to federal-wide assurance. It's a kind of contract we make with the federal government. And we say, when we do research, we assure that we will do certain things. We will follow the common rule, which is the set of regulations that govern human subjects research. We'll get to that in 1 second. And we will follow the Belmont Report. It is literally stated in that contract concerning federal-wide assurance. The words, the Belmont Report, is there. That is, these principles we have agreed to follow as our practice. Not just as a matter of it's nice and pretty and all nice cushy things, but because we now are contracted to. Okay? So the Belmont Report, note, comes directly out of Tuskegee. And the concerns for Tuskegee are right in line with what Beecher's concerned with. And Beecher's concerns come right out of Nuremberg. All of this is your history to own as research professionals. Right after the National Commission completes its task, a new commission is developed called the President's Commission, even though it's called the President's Commission, and nowadays bioethical commissions are all created out of the executive branch. This one is actually a congressional commission. It was created by Congress to follow up on the National Commission and get more down in the weeds. So one of their first things, you can't see it because it's the only image I could get and it's a terrible JPEG, it says Protecting Human Subjects, came out in 1981. And in this book, it's about yay thick. In this book, the President's Commission argues about, all right, now that we have these principles, what does this really look like? What should the federal government be concerned with in light of these principles of Belmont? And so they say things like, look, we don't have a set of common federal regulations. Every darn institution around here has its own set of regulations regarding human subjects research. We need one set of common regulations. You need an office specifically dedicated to protecting human subjects. Regular updates from PIs. You don't just send them on their way and say, oh, we'll check in with you once in a while if we feel like it, right? Need specific protections for vulnerable populations. Specific protections. And then things like, if negative consequences happen, if you're guilty of misconduct as a researcher, something should happen to you. Your federal funds should be taken away, something. I mean, it shouldn't just be, oh, you screwed up, okay, here's some more money to go do something else, which is what happened quite a bit. So, because of that report, the federal government starts working on a set of common regulations. By 1991, takes maybe a little while, because we're the federal government after all, nothing moves really quickly. 1991, we have what's called the Common Rule, and these are still to this day the set of common regulations that govern human subjects protections. Now, there is one outlier, the FDA. Everybody's got to have an outlier, right? The FDA has its own set of human subjects regulations, so FDA research does not fall under the common rule. It falls under the FDA rules. Frankly, they're very similar. There are some, of course, not unimportant differences, but they're very similar in many ways. And again, it applies to human subjects research. The common rule is not about animal research and IACUCs and stuff like that. It's about human subjects research. There are some exemptions. So certain forms of educational research, publicly available collectible data, public service and benefit stuff, and that is not a typo. It says food tasting. Some people think I meant to type testing. It's not true. Food tasting research is exempted. Not kidding. Is this vanilla? No, it's poison. Boom. No, but food tasting, in fact, is exempted from it. So, and there are 4 main sections to the common rule. First section is about human subjects research in IRBs. It is the longest of the 4 sections. It's about twice as long as any of the others. But notice the other 3. So while the first section is the longest, most of the sections are about what? Or at least populations that might be considered vulnerable. There are some debates about whether pregnant women should be considered vulnerable. But in general, the idea is these are populations that need special protections. And that goes right back to the President's Commission, saying not only do we need a common set of regulations, we need special protections for the vulnerable. Why are they so concerned about the vulnerable? Because they can't speak for themselves, but because of our history. Because of our history. Slave-based research in the 19th century. Different kinds of prison research in the early 20th century. Tuskegee, Nazi atrocities, you name it, right? That's feeding the concern for vulnerable populations. And it shows up time and again in our documentation and our regulations. It's our history. This history feeds this whole thing. Please.
I've noticed that most of this is addressing federally funded. If it's not federally funded, how is it regulated?
So if it's not federally funded, 2 things. If it's not federally funded legally in the scope of things, it need not follow the common rule. If no federal funds are rule, then it need not follow the common rule. However, if you're a place like us under federal-wide assurance, we've said, for example, if it's not federally funded, we're still going to follow the regulations, and it's going to have to meet the letters of the regulations. So institutions can require that in order to do the research at their institution. So in this institution, even not federally funded stuff still has to meet all of this. But as a general rule, right, not federally funded, it's not under the federal regulations. That's right. All right. Here's the thing. So I told you about those definitions and those concerns. We've got to get clear. This is about human subjects research, so we need to define 2 things very carefully. 1, research. Research is a systematic investigation including research, development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. We will come back to this definition over and over and over again. Why? Because it has 2 very important features. A systematic investigation. We don't just throw stuff at a wall. A systematic investigation, and 2, for generalizable knowledge. It is not about the individual in front of you. This research is not about the individual in front of you. It's about generalizable knowledge. In point of fact, I'd even say most research is about the intervention, not about the subjects. It's not about the participants who are part of it. It's about the intervention. We're trying to learn if the intervention is any good, whatever that intervention is. Okay? Second, human subjects. A living individual, notice that, a living individual, about whom an investigator, whether professional or student, conducting research obtains data through an intervention or interaction with the individual. So if I interact with the individual and gain some information, that is human subjects research. Or if I just get their identifiable private information, but I've never seen, heard, touched anything, them, right? So if I just have certain kinds of data, that alone would make it human subjects research. And it says living. So again, the federal regulations say it has to be a living person. We here, even at UAMS and other places, have on occasion argued that deceased persons would still need to be covered by IRB and other regulations, because we believe that there are certain protections they might also be afforded, but the federal regulations don't require that. So again, it could be institution specific. You can change some of these rules as long as one might say they're more, not less restrictive. So before we take our first break, we're going to talk a little bit about respect. So that's our history, okay? The point is to put into context our history that gets us the three basic principles of Belmont and the federal regulations, right? Those two things together undergird the entire issue of ethics in research. They're right underneath there, and we will point to one or the other of them or both as we talk about all of these subjects for the rest of the day, the next 22 hours, okay? All right. And so what we're going to do is actually use the three principles to kind of guide the rest of this whole class, all right? We're going to start with respect. Eventually, I will leave you in the capable hands of Leah, who will then talk about beneficence and justice and other related things, okay? So that's how this is organized. So I'm going to start with a little bit about demonstrating respect. We'll take a break, and then we'll talk a little bit more about demonstrating respect, because respect matters, doesn't it? We want to respect. I like respecting sometimes, except my kids. Brats. No. All right. So we're going to think about respect in terms of providing adequate informed consent, protecting vulnerable populations, and avoiding, coercion and other types of things that overplay the voluntariness or undermine the voluntariness, we might say. So those are different ways of demonstrating respect. We'll talk a little bit about some of that. Avoiding things like exculpatory language, so that in consent forms, for example, we can't say, and when you sign this, you sign away all your rights. We can do anything we want to you, ha ha ha. No, you can't use that kind of language. So back in 2013, a story came out because the Office of Human Subjects Protections actually took on a particular trial called the support trial. It was a neonatal trial. It's an oxygenation study. What they did was they were concerned about retinopathy of prematurity. This happens when you get too much oxygen from these ventilators and stuff that the babies, little tiny neonates, go on sometimes. And that retinopathy of prematurity is a blindness. Go blind. And they were concerned about this. And they wanted to look at vent settings to see if different types of vent settings could avoid retinopathy of prematurity on the one hand, but why you give them so much oxygen? Because on the other hand, without enough oxygen, they would die, right? So these are kind of your two endpoints, right? On the one hand, retinopathy of prematurity. On the other hand, well, death, right? And the question is, how do we find the right balance? Minimizing this morbidity retinopathy versus mortality. Oops, went too far. So what they did is they blinded two arms, and they said, look, in standard practice, this was the claim, in standard practice in a neonatal intensive care unit, oxygen saturations, OSATs, you know, sometimes you see little things that go on fingers and stuff, but OSAT levels can go between 85%, that's pretty darn low for you and me, by the way. Right now you're OSATing up hopefully around 99, if we're lucky, right? 85% up to around 95%. That's kind of the acceptable range of titration of OSATs in general practice in a neonatal intensive care unit. Now, people using their clinical judgment will range within those parameters, okay? What the support study did was it said, okay, on the one hand, there's this low end, 85 to 90-ish, and then there's this higher end, 90 to 95-ish. So that 90 to 95-ish hypothesis is maybe more retinopathy of prematurity. On the 85 to 90, or maybe more death, we're going to see if one side is better than the other. That if we can keep it down in 85 to 90-ish level, will that minimize retinopathy of prematurity but keep children going, right? Or the other way around, right? Maybe the other way around. And what they did was they created a situation where they blinded what was going on with the vent, not only to the parents at the bedside, but to the investigators, the clinicians. The clinicians were required to keep it within that range, and what they did is they had little bells and whistles that just told them when they were out of range, and they had to make small adjustments. But everything had to stay within the range they were sorted into. Babies were sorted into one range or the other, okay? Now, investigators used the language in their consent form of this was standard of care, that the range that your child is going to be in is within the standard of care. That was the language in the consent form. And the problem is that masked what was happening in each child. That is, it didn't well explain that the protocol was constraining the physician's clinical judgment, right? That the physician who normally would look at the ventilator and go, well, I'll adjust a little bit, maybe push it up to 95, maybe push it down to 87, whatever. That clinical judgment was constrained by the protocol. The protocol said it must stay within this range, and frankly, the physician didn't even know which range it was staying in. Just bells and whistles said adjust, okay? And yet the consent form that parents were signing used this language that said you could be routed into one arm or the other, but it's all just standard of care. Now, in some sense, that's right. That is, it's within the range of what people understood to be standard of care. There was no actually great standard of care, by the way. It's not like people have written up the standards are. But that being the case, it's still the kind of language that undermines the ability of parents to understand what's happening, right? That clinical judgment is in fact constrained. That the baby in the next bed, who's not on the trial, the same physician walks over there and just goes playing around on the vent. But that's not what happens with your baby. Okay? Hester noted that, by the way. He was really, boy, smart guy. And OHARP said in their initial finding that the folks at UAB, who were the head site, but there were 23 different sites, it was a finding of non-compliance because they didn't properly explain the risk-benefit ratio of what was going on here. What were the risks benefits in the disclosure? The problem with that argument, and OHARP eventually pulled their non-compliance determination. The problem with that argument is there weren't really any research-related risks. That is, these were still risks that any child would have who's in the neonatal intensive care unit because they were playing within standard of care. There weren't particular risks to these children. What there were different practices. And parents deserve respect enough to be able to determine, are these the kind of practices they want their child to be subject to, right? I mean, they might say, boy, that sounds really interesting. I'd be happy to do that. I see that it's within standard of care, and maybe this will help my child's retinopathy or what have you, keep them from having retinopathy at prematurity. Others might say, I want my physician to be able to have full reign over doing whatever he or she thinks is best for my child. And this is too constraining. I don't want that. Turns out, by the way, the children in the study did better than control groups. Okay, so they in fact did better. So you might say at the end, even the risk-benefit question falls apart just as a post hoc analysis, right? You look at it and go, oh, no, it looks okay. But that's not the issue. The issue is, how do we respect the people who have to make these decisions? We need to demonstrate respect, and the language in the consent form didn't do that. It didn't demonstrate the proper respect. Basics of consent are this. Look, always remember, consent is a process. It's a process. It's a process. It's a process. You're going to hand out documents that people are going to sign, and you're going to say, woohoo, I've got somebody else in my protocol. Yay. That's not enough. That doesn't demonstrate enough respect. Because if the protocol is more than just a 5-minute deal and we're done, if it has any longitudinal qualities to it, they are subjects for that whole time. And their consent to the process, if they are volunteers, must be a process of consent so that they can know at any time what's going on with them, what matters, and so they can make a decision to stay in the trial or leave. That's what voluntariness means. Ongoing for the participation includes all information a reasonable person would want. Now, I am the single most reasonable person I know. Ms. Leah back there, not so much. So I don't know which standard of reasonableness you want to pick, but we're going to use that language. All right? Unfortunately, I mean, it's a question-begging language, right? I mean, that is, the point is, what actually constitutes reasonableness? I'm not entirely sure, but I'm not sure that there's a better language that we've found to substitute for that yet. Requires language understandable by the individual patient who would become participant or individual participant. Includes the opportunity to ask questions at any time. That's just basic stuff, and it goes beyond, right, just the consent form. They need to know they're in a research study. So again, think about the parents in the support trial. They could be completely, I mean, it would be no surprise if they thought they were completely under a treatment process. And what's the difference? The difference is that the research trial is about the intervention. The clinical process is about the child. Right? So the baby in the bed next to the research participant, that neonate, everything that's happening is happening for and about that child and his or her condition. But in the research situation, everything's happening to learn about the intervention. It's not that we don't want good things to happen for the baby. We do. That's why we're doing the trial. We're trying to learn. But that's not the point. The baby's data is what we're trying to grab. She becomes or he becomes a data point in the research. And so parents or anyone else need to recognize that's what's going on. When they agree to this, they take themselves out of everyday clinical care and clinical judgment and put themselves into a protocol process for learning about the intervention. Hopefully not at the cost of their own child. I mean, that's, right? That's the beneficence part that Leah will talk about. In designing the protocol, you have to show that you've weighed harms and benefits and you're thinking it should come out more beneficial. Thinking, right? It's still research. We don't know the outcomes yet. If we did, we wouldn't have to do the research. Purpose of the study, what specifically will be done, their rights and responsibilities, possibility of not receiving study drug, device, procedure, whatever. So, right, if you're in a placebo, if there's placebo arms and stuff like that. Risks and benefits of participating, okay? This is all part of what it means to do adequate informed consent. There are some special circumstances to note. There are opportunities to waive written consent, which is not the same as waiving consent. That is, the consent process would still have to happen, but you might not have written documentation of it because the documentation itself may pose a risk, right? That is, now we have a paper trail. Maybe that's a problem. So there are some rules about that. You can look at those as you wish. There have to be certain conditions for emergency research, right? If you dropped down with a heart attack right now, please don't. But if you did, and we were doing research on how many times to thump on your chest, trying to get your consent to that research would be a bit of a challenge, right? And so emergency research has to have its own special set of rules. For example, you have to have a community board look at your protocol and sign off on it, kind of speaking for the community that would be involved in this, right? The individuals come out of a community, the community now kind of gives prior consent to this process. And then there's rules about pediatrics too, right? Again, situation where kids can't consent for themselves, so we're going to have certain ideas about pediatrics. Assent is the language in pediatrics, and it has its own sets of rules. Pretty interesting ones, in fact, but we won't get there right now. Thanks to an unusual loophole in strict rules of medical ethics, hundreds of trauma patients in California, Texas, and a few other states will be taking a gamble when ambulances come to scoop them up after accidents or acts of violence. Without waiting to get consent, paramedics will inject a fake blood product, Polyheme, into half of the eligible patients chosen to take part in the new study. The other half will get a routine treatment of transfusion with saline solution until they reach the hospital. Emergency research, in general, creates a special set of circumstances, says Kelly Fryer Edwards, University of Washington medical ethicist whose colleagues across the country are divided over the wisdom of the blood study. In a way, all of our usual approaches to research ethics, to protecting human subjects, to trying to get informed consent just go out the window. At stake is a product that could revolutionize emergency medical treatment and surgery. So we're just starting on this, but part of the reason I use cases like this is that they were in the news, that they end up on websites like Wired and other things like that. I want you to kind of note the language here used. So first off, right, thanks to an unusual loophole in the strict rules of medical ethics. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if this is a loophole. Is it? I mean, I don't know. Emergency research does set a special set of circumstances, and we do want to respect participants in research. And we do say that respecting persons is about informed consent. And this is lacking informed consent. All of that is true. So then the question is that a loophole in ethics? Or maybe it is. I mean, maybe that means we shouldn't be doing emergency research because it seems, in one sense, impossible to do research in emergency situations and still gain an individual's informed consent. An individual's informed consent. Right? Am I missing something? So is that a loophole in ethics, or does that mean the ethics has to recognize the realities? One or the other has to give. That is, either you stick with the principle that respect for persons is about strict, individualized, informed consent, or you have to say, maybe there's an ethical way to do this without still respecting persons. Remember the principle, and this is the thing, and this is why it is important to make the division between the principles and the applications, because the principle is respect for persons. And the question is, can you respect persons and still do emergency research? If the answer is no, then we shouldn't do emergency research. I think that is what the Belmont Report is saying. We have to respect persons. But when they give us the application, they're just giving us an idea, a kind of example, an important one at that, but a kind of example. So you shouldn't take respect for persons to be equivalent to informed consent. Is it possible to respect persons and still not get their informed consent? If the answer is yes to that, then maybe things like emergency research is possible. That's the thing to talk about, right? That's the ethical concern to talk about, and that's what this brings up. The study raises significant ethical issues, says ethicist Nancy King, who co-wrote an article in the current edition, it's not current anymore, years ago, of the American Journal of Bioethics. This is now USA Today. We moved from Wired to USA Today. That faults the Polyheme trial for withholding available treatment, namely blood transfusions from patients. Now note what the problem is on this page. Different from the problem in the previous one. In the trial, Polyheme is appropriately given to patients without their consent in ambulances, Nancy says, where blood is not available. But some patients, including Williams, he's talked about earlier in the story, also get the blood substitute for up to 12 hours in the hospital, where blood is available. King says some patients who die from their injuries, therefore, will perish while being denied an available treatment. Though she favors the concept of waived consent trials, she says Polyheme could be tested, for example, on the battlefield or during elective surgeries in which you can get prior consent. That is, you can talk to these people before surgery and you can say, look, here's the idea, right? So, and then you could even test it against blood, as opposed to in the ambulance, you're not going to be testing against blood anyway. You're testing against the available fluids, which is saline typically, okay? And so now the problem has shifted, right? It's not shifted from, at least for Nancy, it's not about this loophole in ethics where you don't gain consent. It's now about the design of the trial. It's about whether or not the trial is properly designed such that when known, acceptable, standard medical care is available, people don't get it. And they don't get it without their consent, right? We know blood works. And yet we're restricting some people from having it. See the difference? So now it may still be about respecting persons, but it's also now about beneficent design. The trial has raised concern among some ethicists and alarm in Congress, where Senator Chuck Grassley, chairman of the Finance Committee, is conducting an investigation. Grassley is concerned that people who live in the 19 states where Polyheme is being tested have an inadequate notice about the trial. So there's that other aspect. So to meet the federal regulations on emergency research, you're supposed to have a community board and you're supposed to give public notice. The FDA requires that the community input be sought in the regions around test sites. Now, frankly, Polyheme did do that. So what's interesting about all this is Polyheme met the regs, but have you ever read the paper and noticed anything about an emergency research something or other? Well, one, we don't really do them around here, but Memphis might do it. You might be driving east, right?
Is this the same thing as requesting emergency use from?
No. Emergency use is a different set of issues. It's usually one-off use of something that has not yet had FDA approval, and it's for a particular patient or participant. I don't know what we call them at that point. It's outrageous that for all intents and purposes, the FDA allowed a clinical trial to proceed, which makes every citizen in the United States, this is good political hyperbole, every citizen in the United States a potential guinea pig without providing practical, informative warning to the public. Right? So again, what constitutes practical warning? What does it mean to respect those people who might be part of this trial? Is putting a notice on page 17 of the newspaper acceptable? Is that enough? So there are different aspects to this that you need to kind of be aware of because it brings out different aspects of the concern of respect. All right? And yes, this is a special case. That is, it's an emergency trial and it's a special case. But it all comes back to that principle. All right. So let's take a break. No. No! All right, you had your break. Suck it up. All right. So this is a big responsibility. Beecher said, far more dependable safeguard than consent is the presence of a truly responsible investigator or practitioner, coordinator, or team members. Beecher really believed in a kind of character of the researcher. He truly believed that the reason trials went wrong was the character of the researcher was deficient in some way. That building better character, knowing, holding to principles, things like the Nuremberg Code, those kinds of things, were character issues. And he's right, certainly to some degree. But look, even fully responsible practitioners or investigators teams will face difficult decisions when lines are unclear or values conflict. Really well-intentioned individuals, two well-intentioned individuals can stand face to face and completely disagree on what to do and how to do it. So it's not enough, right? It's what we call a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So let's go back to our definitions again, because this will come back to what matters in terms of respecting individuals who are going to participate. So Belmont, as I told you, has three definitions to think about. Practice. Practice are those interventions that are designed solely to enhance the well-being of the individual patient and that have a reasonable expectation of success. In other words, it's clinical care. When they say practice, they mean everyday clinical care that physicians and other healthcare providers give to patients. Experimentation, they also call it innovation or innovative use of therapy. They use all of these terms, is an innovation that departs in a significant way from standard accepted practice. It is new, untested, or different, but it is still, this is very clear, it is still practice. I guess if I were, if I took a little bit more time with my PowerPoint, I would then draw a line, then a line would magically kind of appear right there. Because experimentation and practice are on the practice side of things. They're about the individual patient's care. And research is the one thing that falls below the line. It is an activity designed to test an hypothesis, permit conclusions to be drawn, and thereby develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Have we seen that language before? Yes, we saw it in the Common Rule. It is not about the individual, it is about the generalizable knowledge. So, just so we're clear on what makes the difference between research and innovation, it's important, see, this is one of those diagrams and you're supposed to look at it and go, wow, that's really complex. Wow. Okay, there. It's the only reason I could figure out they gave that design in that paper. Ooh, complex. Okay. So, how can you tell the difference between innovation and research? Innovation is identified for the purpose of an individual patient. And it's successful when there are no other, it's ethically successful, when there's no other existing proven therapy, existing practices are suboptimal, the therapeutic alternatives are in what we call equipoise. They stand in relatively equal balance to one another in terms of the belief of their success or failure. Physicians use their best clinical judgment in light of that available evidence. Informed consent of the patient, parent, surrogate, whomever it is obtained. It must be informed as to the innovative or experimental nature so that if you are a patient, you should be told, I'm doing something for the first time. Good luck, right? Yeah. And here's the next part, that in order to be ethical, where it is possible, appropriate, practically possible, reasonable effort should be made to turn it into research. Because why? Because research is systematic for generalizable knowledge. Look, we do innovation all the time and never turn it into research. We do. And it's kind of sad because then we're doing things that we don't have the strong evidence base for we should have. So one of the things that's really important in this divide is clinical practice up here, innovation right here, research here. Research is below the line and is about generalizable knowledge. But that innovation has to, I would argue, bleed down eventually into research so that it can then become clinical practice, so that it can move up to clinical practice and become evidence-based clinical practice, right? See, if I used my PowerPoint really quick, I could have done that all in PowerPoint and it would be really cool and you think, wow, he almost knows what he's doing. All right. And I would say it's ethically a failure if any one of these fails. If we don't tell people what it's about, if we don't try to move it into research where that's appropriate. Okay. And I mean, look, why do we do innovations in clinical care? Because it retains individual patient-centered care, right? It's about trying to practice for this individual. We're trying to help this person get better. That's good, right? And it's much more expedient, right? It's the motorboat. We can turn it very quickly. It's not the big ocean liner where we have to wait for it to turn over miles, right? But the cons are we lack regulation and oversight. When you do things into clinical practice, the only oversight you have is the law, is liability, is criminal prosecution. That's it. And so it has none of the regulatory structures of protection for the person it's happening to or for the clinician / supposed investigator, right? And because we're not in the research, we're not developing an evidence base. And so it becomes very difficult to explain what the potential risks and benefits are because we're doing it in these one-off fashions, right? They're anecdotes. Wonderful stuff, but not enough, right? What we end up saying is, well, it really worked for her, right? You know? Will it work for you? Well, I don't know, right? So why not turn to research? Look, research acknowledges the goal of generalizable knowledge. It does provide that regulation. It follows evidence-based. But again, it's hard to turn these things, I say surgical practice because surgery is a very common thing, but where innovation happens, it could be anywhere. You know, these things, especially if you're doing surgical one-offs, it can be hard to design a good ethical study for those. So what do you think? What about something like off-label use of drugs as an example? Drugs and devices are approved for specific uses. That's how the FDA approves them. But drugs, clinical judgment is allowed for clinicians. Clinician could say, hey, you know what? I want to give you this pill. I think it'll do something for you. Even if it has nothing to do with, or at least seemingly has nothing to do with how you're feeling. That can happen. In fact, somewhere around 70 to 80% of the drugs we use in kids, that's what we've done. No clinical trials in kids. They're just really small adults anyway. Just bite the pill in half and give it to them. Right? That's what we've done. They're approved for adult use, but then they get shoved in children. Now, after 30 years of using the same antibiotics in kids, we now have built up evidence over time. It's not a systematic, generalizable knowledge research, but I don't think we're going back on some of the antibiotics we use in kids, right? I mean, they work. But we had to get there through trial and error. And probably some mistakes, quite frankly. Mistakes not covered by regulation and oversight. So they can rely on their clinical judgment. This is innovative use. It's not, but how much innovative use is acceptable before a trial becomes necessary? right? How many off-label uses of whatever it is, FDA approved or not, for X? How many times should we take a product for X, use it on Y, before we start saying, gosh, we should really do a clinical trial on this? If it succeeds 50% of the time in the 5 patients we've tried, right? So 2.5 of them get better. Used a good number there, didn't I? You know, the fact of the matter is, what have we learned? I don't know. We've learned it has some possibility of success, but we really don't know how much. Certainly the 5 is not a good high power number. And here's the other thing, right? As I said, under clinical practice, malpractice really becomes your one regulatory device. Right? There's no other regulatory devices. So why are people complaining about malpractice suits and tort reform and all this other thing? If what we're saying is clinical practice is only regulated by the fact that people get to go sue you. No? No what? It's wrong, it's bad, it's good, I'm wrong?
It's not exactly true.
Okay, what else?
You can use unprescribed, approved medications in the practice of medicine. But there are still regulations that you have to pay attention to.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Which is, you have to be sure that the risk is not significantly increased, or the benefits of that risk are not significantly decreased.
Fair enough. How do you know that until you try? That's the beauty of innovative use.
You have to evaluate it.
Fair enough. How does one evaluate that?
Well, before you even use it, you have to weigh the pros and cons of using it and understand if this is going to elevate that risk or not. And
Right, so you look at things like molecules, you look at bioavailability, you kind of say, this looks like it could work, but this is the kind of thing where that receptor, it should works on that receptor. I don't see why it wouldn't work for that. I've seen people grow hair in places they weren't growing before, and they were using this drug for something else, so maybe. Look, yes, of course there's some regulations, but they're not very restrictive. And frankly, they're not very hard to meet given the kind of open question that's even behind all this, which is, I don't know if this drug will work, but I have a theory. And the theory meets with the chemical compounds that are involved, and sure. So yes, you have to do all that, of course, right? I mean, we aren't literally just shoving a pill in somebody just because it's blue, right? Wow. But yeah, but it's not a very high bar to meet. All right, so that's research and innovation just for a moment. And I wanted you to see that because, again, we're trying to define what is this research thing. Because these principles that we're worried about are principles of research. There are principles for biomedical ethics and clinical care, certainly. But what we're worried about here today is research. So, research versus practice. And here's the thing, especially in an academic medical center, we see conflicting roles arise often. So we need to start from a certain basis. Medical clinical care has one goal. Research has another. What's medical clinical care's goal?
Help the individual.
Help the individual get better, be stable, be comfortable, something like that, right? This patient, this individual in front of me. What's research's goal? Right. Contribute to generalizable knowledge. Learn about the interventions or whatever it is in order to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And so the role of clinician and investigator are different, and yet oftentimes they're one and the same human being, right? The PI of the study in the PICU is not some schmo from off campus who's come in order to do this. It is oftentimes the physician in the PICU who's also at times attending to this patient as well, right? And these are the kinds of things where one person wearing two hats really raises concern, potential for what we call conflicts of interest. So, let's put this another way. Here's patient care, all happiness and well-being, right? And there's research, all technical and rah, 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 rah. No, okay, but look, so learning about, research is learning about how to make people better, not about making any particular person better. And that's different. Look, it's, again, I want to be very clear, because sometimes, particularly if I'm talking to hem-onc docs, which I'm not, but if I'm talking to hem-onc docs, they have a hard time with this because they want to say, no, I'm really working for my patient's well-being. I'm sure you are. You're wearing two hats at one and the same time. I would hope with your clinician hat on, you are working for the well-being of your patient. I really want you to. And I even want you can hold on to all the hope you want that this clinical trial will do something for this patient. Feel free to hold on to that hope, but note that the clinical trial puts you in a different role with different responsibilities. Our roles are what obligate us. Research coordinator is a role and gives you obligations. Physician is a role and gives obligations. Nurse is a role. Ethicist is a role. And those roles give us obligations even when we don't want them sometimes. Yes?
I would like to ask too, if you could speak a little bit on the difference between quality improvement and research, because to me, where I am, those seem to be very blurred lines.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess,
And honestly, this whole 72 hours of talking does not get at that the way it could. I mean, we don't talk much about that in here, and we could do a session on it. It is an interesting thing. Right, so it's a great question. So there's a famous case 7 years ago, something like that. A Michigan health system was doing what they considered QI processes on sepsis in their intensive care units. And it was a health system. So they were gathering data on sepsis across different hospitals. And what they did was they hired Johns Hopkins to run the data. And that hiring of Johns Hopkins triggered the federal government. And initially the federal government said, you know what, you're doing research. Because you are going across these institutions and now trying to generalize practices across that from this knowledge. And they argued, no, this is quality improvement within our health system. And the fact that we grabbed Johns Hopkins, they were just really good at the data crunching, and we wanted to use somebody who's really good. And we're a health system. They weren't an academic, it wasn't University of Michigan, it was a health system. So they thought they should grab some outside folks. And it went back and forth both in the courts, at the federal level of institutions, and among ethicists about what this constituted. Is this generalizable knowledge? There are practices like that. It's not easy. Ultimately, it was determined that it was a QI process because it was kept within the system. Now, here's the thing that's really challenging. Kept within the system. Did the system ever publish its results? Yeah. Because they learned something as a system and they wanted others to learn. Gosh, we learned something, we want you to know, right? Now it's pushing up. Now, publication is not by itself generalizable. That is, we tend to say, well, if you're going to publish it, it's generalizable knowledge. That's not the rule. The rule is generalizable knowledge, right? There's nothing about publication in the federal regulations, right? It doesn't say if you, but yeah, I mean, if you're publishing it, you're trying to get it out beyond your walls, right? So there's an aspect of intentionality in all of this, which is really hard to get at. What is intended? The argument was we intended this. the entire design of the protocol, all of that stuff was intended for internal system learning, thus QI. And the courts ultimately accepted that. But the answer at one level is, what's your intention? And the problem with that answer is, we don't always know everybody's intentions, right? They don't wear them on their face, right? We can hide our intentions if we really want to. So it's a great question. There's not a clear answer other than if your intention is internal improvement and development, that's the intention behind the design of what you're doing, then the idea is that that's QI and should be there. But it's not a hard and fast line. There's no clear line, either in the regulations or for matter in ethics necessarily, that can clearly delineate those. Because you're right. Some QI looks a hell of a lot like research, right? So, and in some sense, that's good. That's good that we're doing QI that carefully, right? Systematically developing a good protocol to follow so that we can learn from it. I mean, we want those kinds of careful practices in order to learn, and yet, shouldn't we? Because what's the difference? By not being research, none of these federal regs apply. We don't have to gain consent, none of that stuff. So I personally always tend to want to tell people, if there's any question, treat it like it's research. That's my position. But that's a headache for people. I don't deny that. All right? I'm not saying, well, that's easy. Gosh, just go turn it into research and you'll be happy and everybody will be great. It's not that easy. But that's my ethical position on it because I like the protection of the regulations. I mean, the regulations aren't perfect, but I like that there's protections built in, particularly for participants, so they know what's going on. Okay. So one of the things to think about, particularly in an academic health center, is you have to think about this move from patient to participant. That is, many of the participants we get into clinical trials are patients first. They come to us not simply to be research participants. Sometimes they do. But oftentimes they come to us because they're patients, and then they get approached and brought into clinical trials. And so we have to ask ourselves, when is it justified to ask someone to change their role, right? We have two roles, clinician and investigator, or at least some of us do, right? Have two roles. They would have two roles, as a patient and now a participant, and those are different roles. And so there's an ethical question. When are we justified in asking somebody who is there for everything to be about them to now be a data point for generalizable knowledge?
If the doctor has been working with that patient and knows that the patient, let's say, has a desire to, gee, I wish you could do something about the ringing in my ears. And they say, well, I've done clinical trials on that, but people in the clinical trials, the placebo worked as well as the drug we were trying.
Mm-hmm.
And then, say, 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, whatever, hey, we came up with something I think will work for you, but it's still in clinical trials. Do you want to?
I got to be really careful on that one.
Yeah.
We'll get there in a second. Because that's an interesting way you just said that. So maybe. What we have to do is start with this. If it's clearly minimal risk, and whether or not people think surveys and blood draws are clearly minimal, I guess we could argue about, but that is, whatever you consider really low level, clearly minimal risk, you're justified in asking somebody to put themselves out for that. At least to ask them. They can still say no, but to ask a patient to become a participant in a clearly minimal risk trial, it's justified pretty much on its face. Beyond that, however, there are two different rationales that have been given. One's called the uncertainty principle and one's called clinical equipoise. And the difference is really a matter of perspective. So the clinician under the uncertainty principle, needs to be in equipoise as regards to the choices at hand. That is, if the choice is, if you're looking at a clinical trial, and say it's a 3-arm randomized controlled trial, if the clinician, him or herself, looks at it and says, I cannot reasonably see a major difference between the 3 arms right now. Where we stand, I don't know which one will do any better or worse for you. Okay? That's the uncertainty principle. The individual clinician stands in equipoise, that is, they're equally balanced, equipoise on all 3 arms. Okay? Using a 3-arm trial in this case. Clinical equipoise, it's argued, is you stand in relationship to those 3 arms, but it's not you as the clinician who gets to make that call. You make that call on behalf of the medical community. That is, you have to stand in the place of not what you think, but you know down the hall, there's disagreement with some of the people in your group. Maybe you think one of the 3 arms is probably a little better than the other 2. So you're not in equipoise. But you also know that other people in your practice and papers out in the field are saying, you know what? That's your clinical judgment, but it doesn't meet with what we currently know. We're not sure that it's necessarily better. Then the physician is under an obligation to stand in clinical equipoise. That is, from the standpoint of the medical community, there is equipoise, and the clinician is justified in suggesting that a trial might be acceptable. So it's clinical equipoise that we tend to support in the United States. If you read some of the articles from Europe, they tend to go with the uncertainty principle. So that's when it's justified. Now, as we move from justification into kind of recruitment and discussion, how do we continue to demonstrate respect? Right? So again, all of this that I'm talking about is under the concept of demonstrating respect. All of this. So how do we continue to demonstrate respect? We have to be aware of something very important. Because this is a situation that again, we talked about research versus innovation. Right now, we're talking about research versus practice. I realize that not all research on human subjects comes directly out of clinical practice, so don't misunderstand me. But that's where we are in this talk right now, is under this tension between research and clinical practice. And because of that, we have to worry about a thing called therapeutic misconception, all right? Therapeutic misconception has been defined a number of different ways. One, kind of the earliest definition comes from Paul Applebaum and his colleagues. And it's a failure to appreciate that randomized controlled trials impose guidelines on practitioners that interfere with direct therapeutic care. In other words, think of the support trial, right? The problem with the support trial, as much as anything, was a problem of therapeutic misconception. That the way the consent forms were written did not clearly explain to the parents that what they were agreeing to was something that interfered with the clinician's ability to practice individualized care. All right? So according to Applebaum, that's a failure on therapeutic misconception. The idea is those people agreeing to be part of a trial believe they're getting therapy when in fact they're part of research. They believe they still have their patient hat on, but in fact they are participants. They are data points, not getting individualized care. So it could be, according to the National Bioethics Commission, back in 2000, the belief that the purpose of a trial is to benefit the individual rather than gather data. A different way of kind of saying a similar thing. That is, but not exactly the same, right? So you could have therapeutic misconception according to them whenever you just think, hey, I'm going into this and this is about me. And this is part of the problem with how you just put it, Vicki, is part of the problem is if you say, I think this trial can benefit you, you start the process of possibly setting up therapeutic misconception, that it's about you. I'm putting you in this trial for you, right? Now, again, this is a hard balance, so don't misunderstand me. It is a really hard balance because these people are also clinicians. They do want things they don't want to put you into something they think will do worse for you, right? With their clinical hat on, that's not what they're trying to do. But you have to be careful how you do this so that the participant doesn't agree under the wrong set of attitudes or conditions or beliefs, right? That the participant doesn't have false beliefs about what he or she's agreeing to do, right? Believing that research will provide therapeutic benefit. So this is another way that is, and this one is a little different and much broader than the other definitions if you look at it. Because frankly, research might provide some benefit. And so is that really a misconception? I don't know, some people don't like that definition so much. So there has been at least some consensus work on this, and a group got together to kind of do this, and they said, look, therapeutic misconception is simply this. And why this matters is I want you to keep this in mind. Therapeutic misconception occurs when the participant does not understand that research is aiming at generalizable knowledge. That what they're agreeing to do as a participant is to be part of a process where the goal is generalizable knowledge. The goal is not about your health care. Again, you may benefit, but that's not our goal. When you agree to be a participant, that's not our goal. So you have to be careful. You gotta be careful so that you keep things clear. Patients may, as they think about becoming participants, may react to the therapeutic intent. So again, if it's a hem-onc trial and we've got multiple arms and stuff, they may say, ooh, I'm looking to get that new combination drug therapy for my cancer. I really want that. And again, they are welcome to want that, all right? But if it's a randomized controlled trial, we've got to be very clear that because we're looking at the intervention and not about their well-being, they might not get it. Okay. But what it is not is it's not just simply therapeutic misestimation. That is, some patients who want to become participants may just underestimate risks or overestimate benefits. Those are problems. Those are absolute problems. But that's not a problem with therapeutic misconception. Or sometimes what we call therapeutic optimism. Again, they may absolutely want and kind of hold on to hope that this will make them better. And again, they're welcome to. But we have to be aware of that so that it's not interfering with their agreement, their voluntary informed agreement. That's what respect means. We need to remind them that research uses unproven methods. Standard of care typically uses proven methods. So that's a shift between those two things, and we need to be clear on that. And that research is risky. Of course, so is standard medical care sometimes. So again, just recognizing what's the relationship between research and practice. Okay? Turns out that therapeutic misconception has been kind of measured in prevalence, and the reason for the big difference between 30 and 90% is depends on the kinds of trials. So it turns out if you're a phase 1 cancer trial, 90% of patients who agree to become participants demonstrate some aspects of therapeutic misconception. But in certain kinds of genetic studies and stuff, it's much lower. So the type of study itself may foster therapeutic misconceptions in ways that other studies don't. It's interesting to know that 85% of patients, as many as 85%, will fail to cite research-related disadvantages and risks as risks of their participation. And part of this, in the next slide, you'll see part of the reason for that. As many as 90%, but around 2/3 will say that they cited research as a better option, right? That they're going to get a better chance at good care. Because many people, they're sold the idea that research is really the next best thing, right? Things aren't working terribly well for you now. But the next best drug is coming down the pipe, and I can get you into that trial. The problem with that is trials fail. Trials fail. Do you know what percentage of drugs make it from phase 1 studies all the way through FDA approval?
Less than 10%.
Yeah, it's right around 10%-ish. Make it all the way through. Some of that's failure, some of that's economics. All right? Some things do okay, but aren't economically feasible once they go through the whole process.
Are researchers required to tell the participant that they may get the placebo up front?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's all part of your consent, right? It's a 3-arm trial. You're going to be randomized 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So you have 1/3 of a chance of not getting any study drug. Not getting any drug whatsoever. Getting a placebo. Right? Yes, absolutely. And again, these are not necessarily bad things. They're things to be aware of if we're going to demonstrate respect. So 65 to 70% do it because, for example, they trust their oncologist if it's a hem-onc trial. I just trust that my oncologist is doing what's best for me. That's why he or she is offering this trial. Again, I don't mind them trusting. Please understand. But understand that that can interfere with their careful consideration of the role they're taking on. The role of participant versus patient. We'll go past that, not necessary. So, why might someone be a research participant? I mean, after all this, gosh, why would anybody agree? I'm banging on this. So, you might say some people might tell you that it's to get the latest treatment available, and this is not a good reason to participate in research. Research does not try to help one individual get better. Okay? If somebody tells you, I'm in the trial because of that, they've given you a very bad reason to be in the trial as a participant. Again, their hope is one thing, but if you're asking, why are you in a trial? Learn something about him or herself. This is okay, but you have to be careful because it may not apply. Oftentimes, our research doesn't necessarily feed back to the individual participant. Oh, by the way, you fell in this part of the curve. We don't often say that. Some trials do feed back information. A lot don't. To help healthcare professionals learn about a condition or treatment. Well, guess what? That's a good reason, right? Because that's what it's about. It's about a condition or a treatment or a situation. Okay. One other set of factors to think about in communication. Psychology itself may be interfering with reasoning depending. So as patients become participants, they often register optimism and hope, not understanding when you talk to them about why they're going into research. So study personnel are not often very good at correcting those certain assumptions that are feeding that hope. Again, I'm not trying to take anyone's hope away. I just want them to be realistic about what they're agreeing to. Okay? The other thing is, so Lynn Jansen and group have also shown that participants have a high level of unrealistic optimism. And this comes actually right out of social psychology research in other areas. Lynn had been reading social psychology research about people kind of holding on to optimism, that if you, just in general, if you go up to a human being and say, 80-20 chance, 20% chance that things will go well for you, and an 80% chance they'll go south. Turns out that quite often you'll say, I'll be in that 20%. Right? Somebody's got to be there. Why not me, right? Right?
Especially if you have something that there's no known cure for.
Right. I mean, especially, right, that's the point, exactly the point. So Lynn said, social psychology research shows that this is true of the human population generally. Wow, what about under these conditions? Does it apply under these conditions? Does it exacerbate it? Or does it actually mitigate it? Does it somehow, those conditions, maybe people are less optimistic because they're feeling the weight of their diseases and stuff? No, she actually was able to do the research and show, nope, in point of fact, that optimism still carries on, even under these highly charged medical conditions. So just, again, be aware of that. Knowing this helps you respect those people as you try to work with them.
I am Leah Eisenberg from the Division of Medical Humanities, also known as part of the medical ethics team here at UAMS. You've met Micah Hester and I. You've now met 2/3 of the ethicists at UAMS. Fun fact, we are the smallest division in the College of Medicine at 3 strong. Anyhow, I want to begin by saying if anyone has had a cookie or a soda, you have, by taking that, entered into an unknowing contract to participate more in this half of class. So just know, I have seen if you've had a snack. So no, I'm going to have several more cases. I would love to get people's input. Don't feel shy, don't feel ashamed. I like to have a participatory class. And feel free to interrupt any questions, comments, grievances you have. So we have completed our another break. And now we're going to go to our another case. This case, as most of our cases in this half, are actual real-life cases. This is about Jesse Gelsinger. Has anyone heard of him? No? All right. Good. It'll be exciting and new. So Jesse Gelsinger, he was not sick before he died. He suffered from a disease I'm about to butcher, ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, a rare metabolic disorder, and it was controlled with a low-protein diet and a variety of medications, 32 pills a day. He knew when he signed up for the experiment at the University of Pennsylvania that he would not benefit. The study was to test the safety of a treatment for babies with a fatal form of the same disorder, OTC. Still, it offered some hope. The promise that someday Jesse might be rid of these cumbersome medications and the diet that's so restrictive that he could maybe sometimes have half a hot dog. And he said, so what's the worst that could happen to me? Well, spoiler alert, we're talking about research ethics, and so the worst happened. So his therapy consisted of an infusion of corrective genes that were in a vector of a weakened cold virus. So the vector, is to sort of drive these corrective genes into his body. So the Penn researchers had tested their vector at the same dose in a variety of animal models. And they'd seen, some flu-like side effects, some mild liver inflammation, but that disappeared and seemed fairly transient. But when Jesse got the vector, he suffered a chain reaction that the testing had not predicted. Jaundice, blood clotting disorder, kidney failure, lung failure, and brain death, and he did die, obviously. So looking at this, was this a good research design? No. Okay, good. Someone shouted something out, you're my new favorite. Why not?
I'm just trying to get the conversation going.
That's good. That's good. I like that.
Informed consent.
You get an extra cookie.
Lack of informed consent.
Okay. Do people agree or disagree? I don't want to pick on you because you spoke.
I mean, he consented though. He was,
But it didn't seem like he knew what could happen to him, or what.
Okay. So we have a question about, pardon?
he knew he was going to die. Anyway.
Consent and informed consent are two different things.
Absolutely. Talk to me a little bit about that. I'm sorry, I won't pick on you. Does someone else want to talk to me about that? Someone has brought up an excellent point. Would someone like to follow up?
They apparently didn't give him enough information on what they would be doing and what the possible side effects as far as getting the virus might be.
Okay. So I'm hearing a lot of people say this was not informed consent because he didn't know. Does everyone agree?
But it kind of sounds like they didn't know either.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
This is an unforeseen consequence that they had no prior way of knowing whether it would or wouldn't happen, but still as part of informed consent on that side of the sector, they should have listed possibility of, that. I mean, they tell you that when you're going into surgery under anesthesia.
That's right. Any consent you ever sign, if you get a blood draw, they're like possible side effects, infection and death. They probably don't, but I feel like that's listed on everything. Other thoughts? Do we know what the consent form he signed said? No. So that's part of the issue here. We don't know. What if it said the possible side effects, we don't know what this does, possible side effects are bleeding, infection, and death. Would that change your mind?
Would it change people's mind when it says possible outcome of surgery, anesthesia during surgery, Scott? They still have surgery?
Most people still have surgery.
Most people still have. They probably
Yes.
think about it a little more seriously and a little bit longer if it's more prominent in that conversation.
So part of the issue here is we don't know what his consent form said. Then the second question is it like when we get anesthesia where they have to list it and we know that for almost all circumstances the risk of us not having surgery is worse than the risk of anesthesia? It gets back to sort of, what are the risk-benefit balance? And did they know it? And did they, if they knew, and part of what, like you said, they didn't know. Say they knew, we've had some really bad reactions. Is it appropriate for them to even put people in this situation?
No, they tested it on mice and on these baboons, and I'm sure they've had some pretty severe reactions in those populations. They wouldn't necessarily know the human side effects because they've only tested it in one human patient. But I'm guessing, because again, it's not given, that was a healthy human subject,
Mm-hmm.
whereas Jesse Gelsinger was not.
Right.
Not in the sense that he was like sick, dying, but
He had a pre-existing condition, absolutely. To just sort of close the loop on this study, it did turn out also that it wasn't just a case of informed consent issues, that this went a lot deeper, and there was some falsification in constructing the study, where the researchers did have noticed that there was a legitimate increased risk of these terrible side effects and did not disclose that, which puts this not so much in the, is this a risk-benefit analysis, but you're falsifying information and not giving people adequate informed consent. So this led to lawsuits and many repercussions, but I didn't want to get into all of that.
and it set gene therapy back.
Yes, because everyone's like, well, remember that Jesse Gelsinger case, and who would want to enroll in that? He was perfectly healthy, which he wasn't, but he was living in a normal-ish life. He wasn't in the hospital, things like that. So turning to research design and how to do it in an ethical way, I don't know what that's for. I'm just going to ignore it. So part of the question is, what do we hope to gain from research? What are the risks? Well, now I've messed something up.
Just click outside of that box. Or hit escape. I think if you just click this.
I'm not smart enough for any of this. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about what's beneficial research, how do we design participant populations in an ethical way, and the always interesting question of participants and money. So first of all, research is beneficial. I'm going to say something super earth-shattering. Research should at least have a goal of being beneficial, which we shouldn't need to say, but as Micah talked about for a lot of the first half, we have a long history of terrible, unethical research. and not just in Europe and not just, 100 years ago. The Tuskegee study went well into the 70s. So first of all, for beneficial research, it must pose a valid and important question. So my question to you is, what is a valid and important question? What is your goal of research in general? Oh, very good. You even used the terminology. We want to improve generalizable knowledge. We want to find some data that can help large amounts of people with all one disease or people who are all similarly situated. Excellent. So we should promise to answer something worth answering. How is it that we can better treat people with type 1 diabetes? How is it that we can help people with this OTC? So if it's just how much vodka can a dog drink before it passes out, that is not a valid and important question. And as my role on the IRB, I'm not going to approve that. Just be warned. So your methodology should be sound. So do we need a randomized clinical trial? Is that necessary? Should placebos be used or not? I mean, sometimes those things make a really good quality study, but also using placebos might prevent some of your research subjects from getting care that will help them more than others. So you should really look at that. Is this the least restrictive sort of research design we can have? And then obviously confidentiality and privacy must be protected. I say obviously, but this is a problem. Number one, we have more and more data, DNA information, things like that, storage protections in place. At the end, if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about biobanking. But we sort of have this issue between where it's starting to be where we can't tell people we will keep your sample private, because even if we put a code on it, it's still DNA and identifiable. So it's sort of a fallacy to tell people, oh, well, it has a code and no one knows about it. And so how do we deal with things like that? How do we inform people about it? And then the HIPAA regulations must be followed. Those govern how we can disclose people's personal medical information, how we can use it, things like that. So research, it needs to be beneficial. We need to be looking at a legitimate question. So how do we analyze benefits and risk? It's obviously easy to say, well, you don't need to know how much vodka a dog can drink because you should not be giving your dog vodka. That's a terrible idea. But of course, that's a silly example. And ethics and research, research ethics as clinical ethics exist in the gray area. And especially when people have really serious diseases for which there's not good treatment. How do we balance those benefits and risks for them to make sure that we're trying to help them, but also not unduly burdening them? So the potential benefits to the participant and/or society must outweigh potential harms. This doesn't mean that if the potential benefit to society is good that we can, say, well, we can sacrifice that patient for the good of society, obviously. It's more referring to sometimes research is not looking to help an individual patient. It almost never is. So proportionality, so is the amount of risk that we're asking people to assume, is that worthwhile for the possible benefit for them or people similarly situated like them? Is it okay for us to ask research participants to assume any risk? Yes. Right. If we knew that there was no risk, it wouldn't be research. So it's this risk benefit. Like, we're going to ask you, but we think that the risks are going to be low and the benefits are going to be high, and we should disclose that to them. That was part of the issue with Jesse Gelsinger. Part of it we now know they know and lied about it. But say that they didn't. It was either they didn't have adequate information or they didn't disclose it. And neither of those allowed Jesse to give the best informed consent. So back to the therapeutic misconception. It also is an operative constant here in research, and we need to think about it when we are constructing a good research study. So the benefits to the participant and to the society are different. It should not be blurred. And I think, one of my research interests is informed consent, and I'm on 2 IRBs here. I think this is it's a big issue, in part with the way we construct research forms. Sometimes we're trying to appeal to people's altruism in getting them to enroll in research, but we need to be careful that that is not sort of coercing them into participating in research. So looking at these two, I maybe have a laser pointer, but I don't know. I'll just point. Which of those do you think more speaks to the benefit to the individual patient? Is it, we hope to gain valuable knowledge about treating your disease, or patients with your condition may benefit in the future from this study? Okay, so I'm hearing the second one speaks more to the individual patient. Does someone want to talk about why?
Well, because there may be hope in the future for a condition that the person has.
Okay. Does anyone want to agree or disagree and pick the first? Because I guess the second one is offering, we might actually offer patients with your condition may benefit in the future. But I also think there is an argument for the first one, because we're saying we hope to gain valuable knowledge about treating your disease. So either one I think a patient could take and say, well, they're really talking to me about that. Although this is for research, it's here to help me. And so we need to be careful, and in a certain extent it's hard because patients have this therapeutic misconception. You can even say to patients, this research study is not to benefit you personally. And they'll say, I understand. And then you'll say, why are you enrolling? And they'll say, it might make me better. So it's really hard to overcome that because people have this hope. We heard about it in the first half of the class. And so it's always sort of hard. How much, do we allow people to enroll even if they're enrolling and they verbalize understanding but still have some of that therapeutic misconception? And this also gets back to our clinical equipoise. The balance of potential benefits and harms must be equal for all arms. This isn't to say in actual life they're going to be equal, but say because we don't know if new treatment X is going to be beneficial or not, we can say if you get placebo or new treatment X, we can't tell you which one will actually be more harmful than the other. And so in that way, we're balancing the potential benefits and harms, although that it's unlikely they're going to have the exact amount of benefits and harms. So looking at this, what do you think? Is it okay for people to have any therapeutic misconception and for us to allow them to enroll? Okay.
We can inform them, and they may hear it, but they may still have hope, and that's probably an apple.
I think hope is different than misconception.
Okay.
I don't want the compliance point of that.
I mean, I think they do overlap. They can say, I know this is for others, but it might help me, So would you?
As long as they say, I know this is for others, I know there may be no benefit, then I think there's not as much, at least, misconception.
So you would be looking at if they can verbalize, I know this is for generalizable knowledge, even though I'm enrolling because it might help me, that's okay. But if they just say, I'm enrolling because this is going to help me, that's sort of your.
Like with the oncology studies where Michael was saying, 90% of those people were enrolling because they think that is the best treatment for them.
Right.
It's not treatment for them.
Well, I think, and also that gets back to when you're a sick person, and we talked about patients as participants, you number one, have a lot of trust in your doctor, hopefully, and number two, you want your doctor to think highly of you. Think, well, my doctor really wants to do this research. I want my doctor to be pleased with me, therefore I need to do it. So there's sort of pressure from that way as well.
I want them to be able to verbalize that not only that I'm doing this for generalized knowledge, I understand that's what it's for, it might help me, but I understand that it might not help me. That's the key, is we have to get them to understand that this might help, it might not.
Mm-hmm.
You might not get anything from this. In fact, you might have some risk and be harmed by it more than anything. And that has to be understood.
Okay, so if they have sort of that understanding, that's sort of what Derry was saying, then if they have this hope, we will not totally quash their hope if they have a general understanding about how research works. Do others agree with that? Have other comments? So I love a flow chart. I hate a busy slide. This is sort of both. So this is basically what we talked about in the last slide. In flowchart form, I'm sorry it's little, you have it, I was going to say you have it printed out, but then it's almost impossible. It's like for mice to read. But basically it talks here about, first you have your protocol, are these therapeutic or non-therapeutic procedures. So if it's a therapeutic procedure, are we in clinical equipoise? We think, well, the risks, benefits are sort of balanced. Is it consistent with competent care? Not necessarily we know this is 100% the best care, but this is good, competent care. We're using the best knowledge we have. And related to that, are the risks reasonable in relation to the potential benefits to subjects? So if so, then that is both therapeutic and non-therapeutic procedures would pass that, then it's acceptable. So if you're going over here for non-therapeutic procedures, the risks need to be minimized with sound scientific design, which we're discussing. The risks are reasonable in relation to the knowledge to be gained. And is it a vulnerable population? We talked about that before, and we'll talk about it more in a minute. If it is a vulnerable population, we have this extra step over here. No more than minor increase over minimal risk. And if it's not a vulnerable population, we don't have that extra step. So sorry for the tininess of this, but it gives you sort of another way to look at it for those of us who are visual. So this is sort of, I feel like, what patients sometimes must feel like when we offer them things. Like, here, you can order for lunch. Here's your risks, here's your benefits, you work it all out. That it can be overwhelming and just feel like, I don't know, I just want a cheeseburger. Just you tell me what's right for me. I trust you. So balancing the risks and benefits, not just with the study design, but throughout the study. So we have to monitor the research to ensure patient safety, because obviously, as we've talked about, we only have our best guess going into research about risks and benefits. We don't know exactly how things are going to shake out. Sort of like with Jesse Gelsinger. You know, after Jesse happened, they didn't say, well, let's try 10 more patients and see what happens, because they had new information about severe risk. So participants must not be subject to increased risks. So that is, we are getting new information during the course of the study. We're finding that this is not as, the balance of risk-benefit is not quite where we thought it was. So we need to go back and think about our protocol again and inform our patients. So participants must be informed of any new findings that could affect their willingness to continue, such as, oh, we had a patient last week that got an overwhelming immune reaction and died. That's material for people to know in order to think if they're going to continue. And disclosure of interim results may be indicated. It doesn't all need to be, well, someone died. It might just be that the preliminary results might indicate the risk balance. The risk-benefit are not as balanced as we thought, maybe in one arm of the study, maybe in all arms of the study. This is challenging, though, because, of course, we know from a statistical perspective, it's hard to make a conclusion if we've enrolled 2 patients. So setting aside something like a patient has died, let's say we've enrolled 2 patients and they have both become nauseous from the drug, or they've both had vomiting. And so we think, well, there seems to be some negative, some adverse events that we maybe didn't anticipate. So on the one hand, you think, well, we need to go and talk to patients about this, or maybe we even need to go back to the IRB. On the other hand, it might be coincidental that those 2. It might be once you have an N of 50, it'll still only be 2 that had that side effect. Or it could be when you have an N of 50, you have 50 with that side effect. So that's sort of, it's difficult to figure out with with an adverse event that's not super severe. What is the point where we say, well, we really need to stop, we really need to amend, because getting more people enrolled in our study will give us a better credibility. We'll know tell us more what we're looking at in terms of the research results. And obviously, if we have a study and we only enroll 2 or 3 people, those are not results we can really publish or use very well. Any questions or comments? Does that make sense to people? So research monitoring, this is how is your research data going to be monitored throughout the study? And this depends on how much risk your study has. Generally, minimal risk. Does anyone know what minimal risk is? I mean, it's self-explanatory, but generally, minimal risk is seen as no more risk than you have sort of operating yourself through regular life, which obviously is not without risk, but it's a risk we've all assumed. We got up, we got in our cars, or took the bus, or walked here today, and there was risk involved with all of that. So, you know, it might be a sort of study where you're going to fill out a survey, or you're going to participate in a focus group, that you're part of research, but there's not very much risk. Or you're taking a medication that you're already taking, and they're going to monitor you. So for minimal risk, you need to have a data safety monitoring plan. This will be part of your whole IRB approval. And the data safety monitoring plan is where you report that you're following your protocols, what your preliminary results are, that you have a clear setup for how you are making sure you follow the protocols and keeping track of what's going on in the study. And for minimal risk, you're allowed to keep track of this yourself. You might have to go back and report it, but it's generally seen as in your hands. If you have a more significant risk, then you need a data safety monitoring board, and that will be external to your study. It'll be, you know, people who know a little bit about the disease you're studying, who maybe you need to have a statistician. So they'll look at your results maybe every 3 to 6 months just to keep on top of it. There's a higher risk, so we're going to look at it more carefully. If you start to have adverse events and you're sponsored by you have a research sponsor, it's maybe time to go to them and say, the results are not turning out like we thought, or we're having adverse events, we might need to amend. So that you take that to your sponsor. IRB continuing review, most studies have continuing review. It might be every year. If you're having some problems or there's a high risk, you might have a more frequent continuing review, just so there's more eyes on your study, making sure that things are going smoothly. And if there appears to be a lot of deviations from your protocol, maybe adverse events, there might be an Office of Research Compliant Audit, which is in general meant to make sure that the research can go more smoothly, not to say like, you are a terrible person, but to say, we have noticed that things are not going well in your study. You're not conforming to the protocol we all agreed upon, or you're having a lot of side effects or adverse events in your patients that we didn't see. And we really need to go through and look at that. Is there ways we can mitigate that in the future? Clarify your responsibilities. Why are you not following your protocol? Do you have a study staff that hasn't been informed, or are you just, what's going on? Is it because some of your study staff follow one, process and others follow another process? Just to sort of say, let's all get together and get on the same page and try to get you back on track. So it can coordinate activities of multiple groups. If it's a multi-site study, that's also a way that things can sort of fall apart and not have a cohesive center.
Can I point out just real quick?
Sure.
We might do an audit just as a routine audit also, so everybody who has an IRB approved study is subject to audit, and we periodically look at the list, so it's not going to be just the IRB said audit them because there were protocol deviations, so if you
It might be just for funsies.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to keep you on your toes.
That's why people love you.
I think that somebody has reported something bad, if you get that call that we're going to do an audit.
Thank you for clarifying that. So it might be that your part is totally perfect, which I'm sure it is, and they're going to audit you anyhow because
We're going to audit it anyway.
that's what they do for fun.
It's the audit.
That's right. They have a dartboard in their office for this sort of thing. You're giving away the secrets. So when do we stop a trial? When do we get what's the difference between maybe we need to amend, maybe we need to wait until we have a few more people enrolled versus we need to stop. So participants should never be subject to known unreasonable risks. We had a death last week and we didn't really know what caused it, say Johns Hopkins. That's an unreasonable risk to say, death, and we're not sure why. Participants should not continue in control arms when a benefit has been established. If there is a good, legitimate treatment and we're not giving them any, that's not good ethical research. What did we see earlier where this did not happen? Pardon? Tuskegee, exactly. That we were still not treating people when we had a legitimate, approved, normal standard of care. That's part of what made that unethical. Is just like, that will mess up our research, so too bad for you. Exactly. So that gets to our problem. Of course, all of our facts have problems associated with them. When are increased risks or benefits known? Because we've talked about, is it when we have 2 patients? Is it when we have 10 patients? Is it when we have 15 patients? Outside of something very severe. So if we say we're going to review the results every week, that might increase the chance of a false positive conclusion of statistical significance. We'll say, oh, there was 2 patients this week and 2 patients had issues. That's dangerous. And that might keep us from really making good research discoveries. On the other hand, if we wait 6 months, we might be overlooking some really consequences that we should have looked at after 2 months. So again, it's all balancing. We want research to proceed. This hopefully will benefit a wide number of people, but that doesn't mean we can just sort of look the other way when things seem to not be going well.
You can build those into your protocol, into your study design. You're testing a novel product, a new vaccine that you're developing. You can have it set up where you're going to do a sets of 3, and if you have a certain number of adverse events or any deaths, then you're stopping on that. As you have your stopping criteria built into your protocol before you get started, and outside of, oh my gosh, we've got this going on in 2 patients, when a skin rash or a vaccine injection site reaction might not be enough to actually stop it.
Right. And some of that's somewhat expected. If you're going to inject a lot of people, someone's going to get sore.
But they're making the benefit of, let's say, a drug outweighing the side effect, if you will. Let's say the nausea, like you mentioned. I was on 3 drugs, all of which the label says may cause nausea, may cause dizziness. Be sure you know how you will react before driving, yada, yada, yada. Also, one of the drugs was for a condition, which the condition is dizziness. And it's like, okay, and sometimes these trials allow them to put that on there, so that you have to then go back to your doctor and say, I'm having dizziness even on the drug.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to switch, and say, okay, this isn't appropriate for you to be in this trial because you've got a condition that causes dizziness, and we can't determine whether it's the drug that has the warning label or whether it's actually your condition.
Yes, that's a good point we're going to talk about in a minute. That, when we're enrolling people in research study, a lot of these people have pre-existing conditions. They're maybe not a healthy population. And that also makes it more difficult to sort out. Other comments? So moving on to the principle of justice. Both justice and who participates in the justice of the outcomes that we're looking at in research. Number 1, we're going to talk about access to enrolling in research, compensation for research injuries, and the sort of social consequences of research. And this is where a lot of the big ethics cases have come up in terms of where we haven't looked at that as carefully or as ethically as we should have. So who should participate in research? This is a much more complicated question than you would think it would be, looking at like, well, I don't know, whoever should participate in research. But does anyone know some of the issues about who should participate in research?
When you're going to get into your vulnerable populations, as Micah alluded to earlier, is a lot of the drugs they use in the pediatric population, the older drugs especially, have not actually been tested in the pediatric populations. And so as we're coming up with newer drugs, testing those in the pediatric population. And so that's one, we want to be sure that we're using appropriate doses and administration methods for the population. So pediatrics, they're not little adults. They're different. They're growing. The metabolism, how they metabolize drugs is different. And so that would be a consideration.
Because generally 30 years ago, the research drugs were tested on who? Basically white men. And they were seen as that could be distilled out to all the rest of us, because that's just the general human form, right? And we have found, in the last decades that is really not the best way to do things. We are not all the same as the, white man, 200 pounds or whatever. So we have looked at, well, we need to include more people, but of course that brings complicated ethical issues with it. Anyone else want to sort of speak to that?
The flip side of that is the older you get, your body changes too, and you have older adults that they're not going to be able to give informed consent. They're going to have to rely on a caregiver, somebody that has power of attorney, to say, yes, I want grandma to have this new Alzheimer's drug.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then some people say, well, if they can't consent, maybe we really shouldn't allow someone to consent for them. That's not necessary to their well-being.
It's hard to test dementia drugs in patients that have dementia, which is the population we've tested in, if they can't consent. Then you also have to take a look at ethnicities. There are diseases that that show up in different degrees in different populations, Pacific Islanders, African Americans, Scandinavian, et cetera. And so we have to make sure that we are including a wide range and that we're including all populations that are going to be affected by whatever we are investigating.
Absolutely. So we need to think about first, what do we need to learn from research? What is our purpose? We want generalizable knowledge. Does the age of the participant matter? Yes, we were talking a little bit that children are not just half-size adults. And so if we want to say, well, how will this work in a child? The best way to do that is to do research using children. Does ethnicity matter? You just brought up that. And does gender matter? Yes. So we need to ideally have a range of all of those different, of all of these different demographics, and not, because we want to say, well, we have tested this in a broad strata of people, and so we know this can be, it's not only that we tested it in white people, we also tested it in people from the Marshallese Island, we tested it in Hmong groups, things like that. And also, part of it is we need to look at our risks and benefits shared. Not only do we want to do research with underserved populations, different ages, different ethnicities, because we want to be able to have generalizable knowledge about those groups, but we also, if say we're studying a treatment that might turn out to have some efficacy, we don't want to feel like we have left those people out and they don't have access to participating in research. So we need to look at risks and benefits. And it's still, I think, common to say, in IRB sort of study design, well, we're only going to include English-speaking patients, or we're going to include only healthy adults. And what are the reasons for just including those groups?
Well, English speaking, it's difficult to do a translator. And you have to have different, if you're lucky, you can do a short form version of the consent, but it's difficult to deal with people that you don't speak their language. They can't really be informed. You can't answer their questions.
It's not just a language barrier either. It's also socioeconomic and religious belief systems. A huge population that person A could believe completely different than person C. Ergo, I don't want a blood transfusion no matter what because it's against my personal religious belief versus somebody saying, give me whatever you got, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be careful with literacy. I struggled with this in a study that I was administrating, or not administrating, but a research assistant on, is questionnaires that have to be filled out by that particular subject, and they can't be helped with it. That might be an appropriate time, but it's not always an appropriate thing to exclude an illiterate patient, because that might be actually one of the groups that you need to target and get that into. So you really have to be careful on literacy.
Absolutely, and literacy is an issue. It's really a much bigger issue amongst all different ethnicities, ages, socioeconomic groups than I think is really recognized. That the average reading level of an American adult is 8th grade, and that's across all demographics. And so we need to really look at that and make things simpler for all groups, because I think this is one of my soapboxes. I'm getting on my soapbox. You know, if someone shows me a consent form and it's simply written and easy for me to read, I'm not going to be like, well, you're treating me like I'm stupid. I'll just be like, well, that was simple and I appreciate that. I was talking with a group of medical students last week about a presentation they had to do, and I said, don't think that by making it more complicated, it's going to sound smarter. Make it simple and easy for me to understand. And one of them said, oh, I guess that makes sense. But I do think, especially in academia and in we're operating this high level, it's like, let's use a lot of jargon because it shows that we know a lot of cool stuff. We need to really, really get off that.
And there's medical literacy and actual.
Absolutely. The medical literacy is even lower. Plus, if you're enrolling in an oncology trial and you're sick and you're stressed and you have 100 appointments and you don't want to disappoint your doctor, are you going to be at your best learning time? No. So maybe your best literacy level is 8th grade, and in this situation, you're going to be at a 5th grade level.
And aren't the consents supposed to be like at a 4th or 5th grade level anyway?
I think technically they say eighth.
They say 8th. They say 8th, and I would say,
Arkansas is lower.
Yeah, I wanted to say that.
I think they're supposed to be at 8th, and they almost never are. Because when I review for IRB, since this is my soapbox, I will put it through Fresh, Kincaid, things like that, and I find it's very common for it to be at a 12th grade level or above.
For patients going through like a doctor's office, it is rare if ever that the medication they're going to prescribe for them to go to the local pharmacy and get filled is explained at the doctor's office. You get to the Walmart and they have a consultation area. Have you ever taken this medicine before? Okay, over here in the corner because I need to explain some things to you.
Yeah. So no, it's a big issue. I'll talk about it all day with whoever wants to. But so there's sort of a risk benefit, because there's also, so we want to include, different ethnicities, different genders, different ages, so that we can have knowledge that serves them, and also so that they're involved in research, that they have access to treatments that might help before they're approved. On the other hand, there is some optics that can look bad about this. I think, when there was that man in Dallas with Ebola, and they wanted, everyone's like, why don't we give him that experimental treatment? There was, the experimental treatment that the previous patient had gotten, and it turned out that he was not eligible for it, but there was a lot of talk about, well, he's not getting it because he's African. He's not American, and so he's being discriminated against. On the other hand, if we had given it to him and it had caused, rapid death, it would have been like, why are you experimenting on that man? So there's sort of a catch-22 in that way, that we don't want to look like, oh, well, we'll just test it on people who maybe have less savvy about the medical system, because we can take advantage of them, like the Tuskegee. That letter earlier that Micah had showed, I think that's terrifying, where it said you had bad blood. I hope you've received a great deal of treatment, and this is your last chance. That whole letter is meant to make you, to capitalize on the fact that you don't know what's going on, and to make you feel really freaked out. And I think it would have had that effect on me. I would have been like, oh my God, this is my last chance. So we want to avoid doing that, to say take advantage of a population who maybe is not as good about navigating the medical system. So I think, getting back to maybe why do people just do research on English-speaking healthy adults, it's because it's easy. We can get approved through IRB quicker. We don't have to deal with these complicated ethical issues of maybe taking advantage of anyone. We can get our results sooner, and just it seems simpler, so let's go ahead and do that. And so it gets to, that's the balance. Well, let's just exclude prisoners. That's complicated. So before we go to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit. Micah had mentioned vulnerable populations under the law. I wanted to talk to you a bit about, disregard the law if you like, just for the moment. Who do you think is a vulnerable population? Kids, okay, why?
Because they don't understand what's happening to them.
Okay, so kids, because someone else has to decide for them and we need to really protect them in some ways. Good, who else? Elderly, why?
Because sometimes they might have dementia or don't really understand what they're agreeing to.
Okay, so would you say the elderly in general are vulnerable or elderly who are compromised? Okay, so people who maybe don't have decision-making abilities. Okay,
I would say, even though it's probably not listed in most literature, it's education.
okay,
Case in point, I have a friend who has less than sixth grade education, doesn't understand, cannot pick up the newspaper and read the newspaper and understand what the newspaper says. So what are the odds of that person understanding a consent form?
the other day I was trying to fill out a form for my flexible spending account. And I called my insurance company several times and I thought, I'm reasonably educated. I work in medical ethics. I have a crazy enjoyment of reading forms. I couldn't figure it out. And I thought, here I have, I should be well situated to figure this out. And it was incomprehensible. I called the lady and she explained it. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. And then she's like, well, it has to do with the IRS. And just like, I thought, how do people deal with this? I mean, maybe I'm just exceedingly dumb about the flex spending, but it's true. And you also have to know that you can call and you can agitate, which I think is something that not everyone is aware of. I've lost my train of thought because I was all getting wild up about my flex spending account. Prisoners, okay, oops, sorry. Now I remember what we're doing. Why are prisoners vulnerable?
Well, they're subject to, they don't have the freedom, and they're subject to someone else being over them. Students as well.
Okay, good. What's another reason that students might be vulnerable?
They may think they get a better grade by participating.
Okay, I too participated in that during college. Get extra credit if you come do this psychological research. What is a reason a lot of students enroll in research? Bonus points and? Money. We know the people who donated plasma, things like that. I'll talk about this in a bit, but also when we talk about compensation, but I think that's a good point. Who else is vulnerable? Okay, talk to me a little bit about that.
They're not well, they don't feel good, they're just, and they're captive, basically.
Mm-hmm. They're not in their best place either.
Right,
Yeah.
they're stressed.
Absolutely, and they're sick. When you're sick, you're just like, I don't care, Other thoughts? Who else is vulnerable?
I think people who have just been in trauma like a hurricane or something like that, and that's never been addressed, but they're in a really good position to be taken advantage of.
Okay.
Wasn't there a case like that with Katrina? Something came up that they kind of offered the people that had just been through Katrina some sort of monetary compensation to be involved in something. I think I remember reading.
That may
something
well be right.
like
Can anyone fill that out?
back.
I don't know the details, but there were cases of that where they were offered housing.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's an excellent point. Back to you, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, as well as homeless and people working with poverty,
Mm-hmm.
they might feel like they can't afford the treatment that they, should get anyway, so what's the harm in just,
This is a way it can get some medical care. Very, very good point.
And just to bring the law back in just a tiny bit, women of childbearing potential,
Okay.
we don't know what these drugs are gonna do to a potential
Mm-hmm.
We have no idea.
I do. Can leave the child sterile.
Yeah.
It
My mother
can.
had experimental drugs when she was conceiving me.
Mm.
Think of thalidomide.
Yep.
We didn't know, and oh, well, this child's missing some limbs.
Yeah.
Oops. And we just don't know, and so that's a very, very vulnerable population.
Whenever this comes up, I always like to ask then, do people agree that if you're a woman and you're pregnant that you're vulnerable?
That's a debate.
It is a debate. Is anyone interested in having it?
You may not be vulnerable, but your child will be vulnerable.
Because sometimes this come up and someone will say, just because I'm pregnant doesn't mean I'm stupid. You know, I can still make choices, but then there is the case that it's not just you. So, all right, I'm going to move.
Changes going on in the body because of pregnancy, so if it hasn't been tested in a pregnant person, you don't know how that drug is going to process through a pregnant body versus a non-pregnant body.
And you
Yep.
have a pregnancy brain. That
That's a real
does,
thing.
my colleague had that several times. It's a real deal.
It is real.
Sure.
Or even like thinking you want to do what's best for your baby, and this medication is going to make your baby healthier or whatever.
Mhm.
Like that, like,
It might cause you to feel more coerced to enroll in the research.
Not to be negative, Nancy, but there are some women who could care less. They have a growing fetus inside of them, and what is going to benefit me, regardless of my baby.
Mm-hmm.
Still look at fetal alcohol syndrome.
This is why you see in most research where the risk is more than minimal that you've got the double barrier method, and both the men and women participating in these studies are to abstain or have a double barrier method,
Right.
just to avoid any untoward effect, potential untoward effect.
So excellent. Those were some good vulnerable populations. Some I hadn't thought of before, which I'm going to think about. So we need to balance the protection of the vulnerable and access to the marginalized, which we've talked about before. You know, if we'd said, oh, the men in Macon, Georgia, they can't even, we'll never enroll them in research because, you know, they're not literate, and that's troubling. In some ways, that would be as alarming as the way that we did it, which was we're going to enroll them because they're not very savvy, and we can take total advantage of them. So we need to balance protection versus the benefits of participation in research. And you look at groups, say, like the Marshallese in Northwest Arkansas, have a very high rate of diabetes, and think, if we're not doing some research on them, we're not helping them as much as we could. So the vulnerable populations that are most particularly in the common rule are children, prisoners, pregnant women, I believe the cognitively impaired. The others that we look at in research but aren't as specifically in the common rule are students and military personnel. So military personnel is sort of similar to, say, students, because they're in a place where there's sort of strong inducement to follow the crowd, that there's someone over you. Non-English speaking participants, you know, we've talked a bit before that just having a translator doesn't necessarily get over all the issues there might be. You know, you might translate your form, but it's still not, you know, there needs to be a level of health literacy that might not be there. It might not translate to their cultural and religious background. Economically or educationally disadvantaged. You had talked about educationally disadvantaged. You had talked about economically disadvantaged. So you guys hit all the points and then some. So very good. So how should we know what to think? Always hard. So children in research, you know, we talked before, if we never do research in children, we can't treat them as well as if we do research in children. But again, children are vulnerable and in need of protection. With adults, generally, if you can consent and we have given you information, you can make all kinds of choices, both about your clinical and research care. You know, obviously it needs to be a well-designed research study, but if the IRB has approved it, we think it's okay, we think you understand, you can choose or not. You can choose for reasons that are maybe questionable as long as you have understanding. Just like for clinical care, you know, I talk a lot about clinical ethics, which is if there's an informed adult they can make good, bad, in-between decisions, because with adults, we respect their autonomy, their ability to speak for themselves. With children, exist in a different moral space. Parents can give permission for them, but we don't allow parents to give permission for just anything the way we would allow an adult to give permission for just anything, because children are vulnerable and in need of protection. So looking at our wasteland of terrible research, there was the case called Willowbrook. Willowbrook was a school for children with intellectual disabilities in New York. It was open, I believe, through the late 70s, early 80s. This case took place in the early 60s. It was seen as not well run. Robert Kennedy referred to it as a snake pit. So it generally could hold comfortably about 4,000 children. It held about 6,000. There was endemic hepatitis A, because they were so overcrowded, because it was not a well-run institution. There was no really good, cleanliness, keeping infected children isolated. So there was a physician who was looking at hepatitis and thinking about vaccinations for hepatitis, and he thought, well, here's some kids who have a lot of hepatitis A. I think this is a good place to do some research. So the way he did the research, he actually did get consent from the children's parents, but his consent form was what you call terrible, because it talked about we know there's a lot of hepatitis in the school. This is a way that we're looking at preventing hepatitis. He did say we're going to infect the children with hepatitis and then give them a vaccine. And the consent form said this will either make the hepatitis non-existent or a very mild case. And please let us know if you want your child to take part in this preventative study. So it was very much couched in that this is not very risky and it's going to really keep your child healthy. Of course, he didn't know any of that, really. When he infected the children with hepatitis, they got violently, terribly ill. And also, he was infecting healthy children. And his reasoning for this was, well, they're probably going to get hepatitis here anyway because it's a cesspool. He didn't say that. But, they're probably going to get sick anyway, so why not? So what are some of the problems with that research design? There is no benefit to these kids. He is making them sick. He's giving a terrible consent form. It is not informed. He's taking advantage of a vulnerable population. There was also, the school was so overcrowded, so they did decide, their little nod towards, we're going to do things correctly, is they had a separate wing for the children in the hepatitis study. But because they were so overcrowded, when parents said, we need a placement for our child, they'd say, well, we're full unless you want to be in the hepatitis experiment wing. And so that was sort of undue inducement. So we need to evaluate risk harm, which they didn't do there, because obviously the harm was much more than any potential benefit. And restrict access to who could research children, especially children in an institution like that are at their most vulnerable, which is in part probably why he chose them. So we've talked about that there's a lack of good pediatric data. A lot of medications that we prescribe to children are just sort of based on a guess. This helped in adults, so we're going to try a smaller dose, and then we're going to sort of wing it from there. There's a lot of off-label use. And so we need to look at what are the research needs in the pediatric population. There are a lot of research needs, especially for more complicated and chronic, severe issues. We haven't done a lot of research in what's best for children because we just think this child is seriously ill. Let's go ahead and try this. So the role of parental authority, as I talked about before, in clinical care, we don't let parents just agree to anything for their children. They can agree to reasonable medical care as long as it doesn't cause irreversible harm when there's a good alternative. Say the example is a Jehovah's Witness parent who says, I don't want to give my child blood products because this is my faith. we don't let them make that decision for their child, because a blood transfusion in the scheme of medical things is not very risky, and the potential harms if we don't do it are huge and irreversible. So that's a very obvious case, but of course ethics exists in the gray area. So we allow parents generally to make decisions. If we have approved research for pediatrics, generally we've decided this is something a parent can agree to or not. So there is something in the Code of Federal Regulations about we should solicit assent from children. Who knows something about assent that they are willing to share? Sometimes. There is no hard and fast age. It depends sort of what study you're on, what you research about what children's cognitive abilities are, what your institution says, what group of children. But so assent is generally that we're going to talk to children in hopefully child language about research, about this research project. We're not going to give them the whole range of things we give an adult with consent, because we're not asking the child to consent. But we need them to know enough to make a meaningful decision about whether to participate or not. Of course, legally, assent is not binding, and so there's this big question when you look at ethics and assent. What do we do if the child says no and the parent says yes?
We don't necessarily do it.
We don't necessarily do it. But you didn't say we don't do it.
When that happens, because I'm from children.
Okay.
When that happens, the approach I typically take is I rediscuss it with the child and make sure that they're understanding and that they're not just, no, I'm not going to do it because it involves something I don't know about. So re-education is the first step, depending on the age of the child. If the child ultimately says no, then we don't need to do it. We don't do it, let me put it that way. In my studies, if the child says no, they're old enough to assent and they say no, then we revisit them at a later time and see if they're willing to participate.
Is it required by law that you don't enroll a child if they say no?
No, because it's ultimately the parent's decision.
This is where we weigh a lot of what is their research, what are the risks, what is the treatment, what are, the intervention, what are we doing, and how much is that no important?
And so say a child says no because I don't want to have blood drawn. We allow adults to say no for that. So this is sort of, the regulations talk about we need to solicit assent of children, but it doesn't say what exactly that means, what age it needs to be for, or what happens if the child says no. So all things to keep in mind. Do people need a 5-minute break, or should we push through? Push. All right. I'll talk extra fast. No. So here's part of the letter from the Willowbrook. It talks about, we are studying the possibility of preventing epidemics of hepatitis on a new principle. Virus is introduced and gamma globulin given later to some, which is to say that some kids he made sick and never treated, so that either no attack or only a mild attack of hepatitis is expected to follow. This may give the children immunity against this disease for life. We should like to give your child this new form of prevention with the hope that it will afford protection. So you look at all of this language, my background's in law. This is what we call leading. Because he's not, they're not saying we hope, we're not sure what's going to happen. It's very much in the language of, this will be helpful, don't you want? We're offering you an opportunity. Yes. If you wish to have your child given the benefit of this new preventative, it doesn't say the potential benefit. It says the benefit. So anyhow, that study was terrible. Don't do that. Let's move on to a case. So this is a randomized clinical trial. A proposed research protocol comes before the IRB involving the use of 2 chemotherapy drugs used for the first time in tandem. It's a 4-arm randomized double-blind trial divided as followed. A quarter on the tandem therapy, a quarter take drug 1, a quarter take drug 2, a quarter on placebo. So they're both adults and pediatric populations. This is only for people who have failed twice on standard chemotherapeutic regimens. What do you think of this study design? Good?
Do we know anything about the drugs?
They're chemotherapy drugs.
Brand new?
It says used for the first time in tandem, so I'm going to assume that they have been used by themselves before. We're going to try using them in tandem for people who have failed. See if we can get if double fisting helps. So,
One problem is that 1/4 of the participants will have no treatment when there is available treatment for this disease. That's a problem.
okay. So we're doing what we talked about before is not good. If there's standard care, we need to give them some standard care.
If you took out number 4 and it was only 1, 2, and 3, we'd be doing better.
Okay. People agree, disagree?
But they've also failed twice on other standard,
Mm-hmm. So what would that make this better or worse for you?
Well, if there are no other options,
Okay.
I'm sure there are. I don't know anything about chemo, but I'm sure there are other, potentially great options.
If you fail twice, you're starting to get to a troubling place. But it's true. Some cancers might have more alternatives than others.
But it doesn't outline whether person A was on drug A and that they ever tried drug B, since drug B is a standard protocol before trying the tandem.
Right. So we don't know, have they tried 1 or 2 before? Are 1 or 2 standard therapies? Are these the ones they failed? So we need to know some of that. What else?
I think it's inappropriate to have adult and pediatric populations in the same trial.
Okay, why?
They're not little adults. How can you have standardized levels of treatments for different populations?
Okay.
Are they using these drugs in the same type of cancer patients?
I don't know. How about, is there any coercion going on here? Potential concerns?
They've already failed twice, so maybe they feel like this is going to be their last.
I have to try this because there's nothing else for me. So there's some of that. They're going to feel some desperation maybe. All right, so moving on to this trial and Stephanie. Stephanie Smith is an 11-year-old whose cancer has not responded successfully to her 2 previous attempts with chemo. Her oncologist mentions to her parents that there might be a new experimental therapy that is under review with the IRB. Her parents are interested in getting the therapy for Stephanie, but when they talk to Stephanie, she is just tired of being sick all the time, and she wants to stop the medications that make her too tired and make her throw up. What do you think? Are we going to, it seems like Stephanie is not going to assent. Do you think she should be enrolled in this research? Or what are we going to do? What questions do you have?
How treatable is her cancer?
Okay, and what difference would that make for anyone?
Well, it would make a big difference, but in this research, since there's a chance of placebo, there wouldn't really be any point in pushing her to do it.
Okay, because she might get placebo. So let's say her cancer, she has a 20% chance of 5-year survival. How would that be different if she has an 80% chance of 5-year survival?
Does an 11-year-old really comprehend the outcome of refusal,
Okay.
and that outcome is death?
How would you figure that out?
How many 11-year-olds actually understand what death is? Have they ever been exposed to it? She just knows she's tired of being sick.
Well, but I do think that if there's a child who's savvy about death and things. It's a child who has had a long-term cancer and 2 rounds of different chemotherapies.
A lot of kids with cancer and who've gone through more than one chemo treatment probably realize a lot more than adults do, and the more that adults give them credit for. Not to say that that gives her full maturity in her decisions, but
Would you think differently about this if she had been diagnosed last week versus 4 years ago? Yes, because probably the years of being sick have given her more insight than an 11-year-old who has been healthy up until now. So are we going to allow her to enroll in the study, or are we going to allow the parents to enroll her? What do you think?
What are the other options?
Okay, so that would be something for you. There's maybe another chemotherapy. I don't know if she wants to do it, but that, I guess, we get back to what her prognosis is. You know, if she goes through another round and it's going to be miserable, but she's going to have a good outcome, we're maybe going to think differently about it than if she's going to go through another round for 6 extra months of life.
her predicted survival is 20%. You know, other options might be palliative, and that might be more hitting for her, depending on what it is, versus an 80% outcome where there are several different options, and so maybe the study isn't appropriate, but another option might.
Something similar to this was in the news recently.
Mhm.
About the 17-year-old girl who refused further treatment. She had like an 80% survival.
Right, this was a case out of Canada at the end of last year.
And the law was trying to make her mom make her get the chemo because her mom was taking her side.
That was an interesting case because in the United States, if a child refuses, you know, if a parent refuses chemo with an 80% survival, what are we going to do?
In the US, we take the kids away from the parents.
We're going to get a court order and we're going to do the treatment. This was a case out of Canada, and it was interesting because the court there ultimately decided that the mother could choose this. And it was also sort of interesting because the patient was 17. So like here, even if you force them, in 6 months when the child turns 18, she could say like, done. So that was a really interesting case. Thank you for mentioning it. All right.
Do we know the outcome of that?
Pardon?
Do we know the outcome of that?
Yes, we do. She died within 2 months. So I'm skipping. It was not a research study. This was the Canada one. Yes, the court says she didn't need to go through with chemotherapy. She didn't, and she died fairly quickly. All right, so talking about inducement to research, oh, for Pete's sake. At least now I know how to fix it. How do I keep doing that? All right. So paying for participation, paying people to enroll in research. What are we paying for when we pay people for enrolling in research? Are we paying them because we're taking up their time? Are we paying them because they have to drive here, or they have to take the bus, and they have to take 2 hours out of their day and pay a babysitter, and we want to reimburse them? Are we paying them to encourage them to enroll in our research study? And is that ever wrong? Any thoughts about that? Do any of you administer research projects that pay participants?
I've been a participant in research studies that paid participants, and I've been in them that haven't.
Okay. Did one of them make you more interested in participating?
I was interested in participating in both of them, but the payment was not significant enough for me to say, oh, I'm not going to participate in it because there's no payment.
Okay.
It was nice to have a reimbursement for the time that I had to take from work, the time that I had to take to get there and back.
And it gets to how much is too much. Say someone comes to me and says, I want you to take part in research. You don't have to take any drugs, or, you know, I'm going to do an experimental MRI. I did this during college. And it's going to take about 3.5 hours, and you have to be in the scanner, and but that's all you have to do. Part of me might like just be like, ugh, 3 hours in an MRI, that sounds lame. I don't have time for that. I don't know. I'm not very excited. But if they said, what if you did it and I'm going to give you $5,000? Yeah, like, I'll be over in 20 seconds. So on the one hand, to say, if you want me to take 3 hours out of my life and there's no reimbursement, on the one hand, that might not be reasonable. 3 hours is a big chunk of your day. You know, I have a job, I have a life, and on the one hand, you say, oh, we might want to pay you because you're taking time out of your life and helping us. On the other hand, if you're going to pay me $5,000, is that encouraging me to sign up? Very much so, yes. I'm going to go book a cruise and come over and be scanned 4 or 5 times. So is it ever wrong to pay research participants?
Is it ever wrong?
Let me rephrase. Is it ever right to pay research participants? Yes. Okay, so we agree that it's not that you can never give someone or give them a thank you gift or a Walmart card or a gas card. When is it not okay? Or when is it too much?
Coercion.
Well, how do you decide if it's coercive?
5,000 for 3 hours is a little excessive.
I have an awesome brain to scan. I know, I don't know. Yeah, so we can look at that. Obviously, if I make an example like that, because it's obvious, like, well, that's ridiculous. To do something non-invasive for 3 hours and get $5,000, most everyone, I would imagine.
Let's blur the line and let's go to a study for drug abuse. And we already know that these subjects have a hard time following anything. And so we're going to give them a little extra each time they complete a set or a step.
I participated in a study, not participated as a drug addict. I worked in a research lab that did a study on cocaine addicts when I was in college. And they were paid a relatively good sum for this study. And I always felt sort of troubled by this. Because they're...
Subjects aren't going to finish if you don't give them any compensation. So where's that line between, is this an appropriate compensation? Are we coercing them to complete the study?
Are we helping them with their drug problem by giving them a wad of cash? Yeah. But on the other hand, we want to research, you know, it was looking at cravings in the brain, and that's important information for us to know. So obviously there's no clear answer about how much is too much, but there is clearly a place where it becomes coercive. This is also an issue when people are enrolling their children in research. You know, is this an inducement to enrolling your child? You know, we're going to give you $200 if your child participates in this study. We all like $200. So those are things to think about and need to look at. Yes, we want to respect people's time, the effort they're doing, that they have real lives, and in that case, it's reasonable to think of we want to give them something. But you know, you need to look at where the line is, what the risk benefit is, how vulnerable the populations are. You know, if it is a homeless population, a population that doesn't have health care, is this going to be an extra inducement for them? So compensation for research injuries. This is, you have participated in research, something has gone wrong, you know, short of death, you have, I don't know, you have developed some sort of secondary pneumonia that's very terrible, you have this terrible nausea, there's something that's happened, you grew a third arm, you have been injured by research. So does anyone know sort of what do we do? Does the research project pay for people who are injured during research? Pardon? That's right. There is no clear and fast rule. It depends what the consent's going to say, what the protocol's going to say. It's not necessarily that you enroll in my research, you have a side effect, you get very sick. We might not pay for that.
There's a lot of insurance billing.
Yes?
Out-of-pocket expense. That's one thing that shocked me moving back to the States in research. I was doing research in France, and it's covered. There's no, you're going to be billed, you're going to be...
Well, isn't medical care in general covered?
Yes.
Yes.
There's the catcher.
Yes.
There's the key.
So,
I received free medical care after going through a voluntary research
Mhm.
which I've had since I was a child, and it was a nasal, and you didn't know whether you were getting a placebo or the real thing.
Mhm.
And after 3 weeks, I developed a nosebleed.
Mhm.
I still have nosebleeds.
Uh-oh. So there's sort of a difference between if you're going to have, maybe an adverse event versus if you're having a serious ongoing injury.
But you can't prove it was caused by the drug because allergies themselves cause it.
That's true. That's true. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. So serious injury is rare, especially for a healthy volunteer and an ethically sound research design. But we don't really know. We don't have a good system for looking at how frequently people are injured, what type of injuries they have, if they are severe injuries or there are a lot of it's sort of expected if we do an allergy study with a nose spray, there's going to be some nosebleeds. That would be a sort of expected adverse event. So the guarantee of compensation is also rare. It might be that there's immediate medical care to reverse injury. If you fall on the ground, I hope we're going to scoop you up and resuscitate you a little bit. I think it's less common that we're going to pay for you to have rehab, that we're going to pay for your lost income. I think that's very unusual. And again, depends on the study. Some studies, I also think there's a difference between saying, we're going to do a randomized controlled trial and you're going to get placebo or active treatment, and once it's completed, we're going to give everyone active treatment. That's different than saying we're going to compensate you for research injury. So it depends on the study. It's rare or it's not uniform, I guess, that there is a procedure for reimbursing people, helping them with their injuries. And so talking about some of the issues with compensation for research injuries, sort of what you had just mentioned, it's hard to know exactly what caused things. Was this caused by the research, or was this caused because you have allergies or you have cancer? Or when we talked about Jesse Gelsinger, we talked about he's not a healthy participant. He's healthy for someone with OTC, but he was not, just sort of a normal person with a normal immune system. So part of it is if we say, oh, our research protocol allows us compensation for research injuries, how are we going to prove that this was a research injury? Are we going to start saying, well, as a participant, you didn't follow the rules 100%, so we're not going to pay for your injury? So that's part of the issue. How are we going to show causation? What if it happens later? What if you developed your nosebleeds 6 months after the nose spray trial? It might be related, but it might not, and it's really hard to prove that. So if we say, oh, we're going to pay for your research injuries, and you come and you say, well, I was in that study 6 months ago, our budget people are going to be like, and the other thing is to go through all this adjudication of the claims. Is this expensive for our company who's running the research? Let's just not. It's, again, like enrolling, people, English speakers without complex health histories. It's easier. And we like research that's easy because we can finish it sooner, have better data, publish, get a new grant, all of that. So some potential solutions are to require private insurance coverage and to cover others under Medicaid, to say, well, your insurance will pick up your research injury. There is in Medicare some very limited sort of funding for this, but in general, all insurance companies, generally their goal is to not pay for a lot of things. So if they can say this was caused by something that was not your, this isn't your medical issue, your routine medical care, you entered into this, you have to pay for that out of pocket or go sue the research study. And the other is to create a national no-fault insurance pool. We have something actually similar to this for vaccine injury. People who have vaccine injury, there's a national system that they can report that and sometimes be compensated by. We do not have this, but it is an idea. Huh? It does not seem imminent, but one never knows. Any comments about compensation? Is it a good idea? Should we do more compensation?
I think we should do more, and I have noticed as a general rule, but not hard and fast, UAMS studies, sponsored studies, do not compensate as much as industry studies and outside studies.
All right.
It's just an interesting little tidbit, and it just comes back to that easier to do kind of thing.
And cheaper, we like that too.
Cheaper, but yeah.
So looking at a survey of academic medical centers about their rules about compensation, 51% say no free care. Thank you for enrolling in research. If you're injured, best of luck.
Especially if you're on a
Some free care provided, 16%, which is for 10 of them you get medical treatment, and for 11 we'll give you emergency care. Very sporting of us. Billed to insurance, free to uninsured, 10%, which is again 9 for medical treatment, 4 for emergency care. I have real skepticism about if insurance is going to pick that up. I mean, they'll bill insurance. I would imagine insurance is going to be like, that's not our deal. Billed on a case-by-case basis, 4%. And no publicly available information, 19%. Thoughts about this? Are you surprised by this? Yes?
Do we have any idea if this goes to litigation, if someone were to sue, what the success rate would be on suing the sponsor for the care?
I mean, it's always hard to say how we think a lawsuit will come out because it depends on who's going to specifically see it. If they have constructed their consent form in the careful way which most industry study sponsors have because they have a team of lawyers, they probably have protected themselves pretty well about who's going to be liable for injury and who's going to pay for injury. If it's a very severe and foreseen, like Jesse Gelsinger, it turns out they were falsifying information and it was not good consent. Then you have a lawsuit. If they have given you information and you've made that decision, I think your odds are much lower. Other comments? So speaking of compensation, who's familiar with the case of Henrietta Lacks? A bunch of people have heard of her, read her book, a book about her, I guess. So Henrietta Lacks she had an unusual and aggressive form of cervical cancer that killed her at a fairly young age in 1951. Tissue from her cancer was given to a researcher who was looking for cells that would last indefinitely, and her cells, which are called HeLa for Henrietta Lacks, are just those kind of cells. Part of her unusual mutation has caused them to be really useful for this type of research. She didn't consent to the cells being taken. They were just taken and used and used and used and used. Her family wasn't aware of the existence of this use until the early 1970s, which when I first started looking into this, was really surprised because it really didn't become an issue until the last couple of years. So they've known about it for 4 years, and they've really just gotten attention from the powers that be about it maybe in the last 5 or 10 years. So there has been tremendous, tremendous work using these cells and a lot of good discoveries. Vaccines, things like that. Billions of research dollars have used these HeLa cells, which have been are still in use, common use for 60 years, with no compensation to the family. So the family, her daughter became aware of this in the 70s and started nudging around trying to get information, and it really took about 40 years for this to be given attention. And this book came out, and there has been more working with the family in the last few years, but they have not been and will not be financially compensated, it appears. They now have some role in who gets to use the cells, things like that, but a lot of money was made from this, and they were not consented, and they're not benefiting from it. They have been given some information about their personal medical history, about some of the mutations that they found in Henrietta Lacks. Comments about this?
Ever wonder why we have to have that separate little section that says, yes, I give permission to use my samples for future research?
Mm-hmm. Here it is. And again, it gets back to thinking like, oh, well, that unethical research was far in the past, but that it took 40 years for her daughters asking about it for them to really take it seriously, I think is pretty troubling.
I just don't understand why people think it's okay to do stuff like this.
I think people think that they're doing for good. You know, I'm going to take this sample, but I have good motives in mind. I'm going to help a lot of people. She's dead, and I don't know. I think that, I mean, you look at Tuskegee, and it's hard for me to look at that and see altruism. But I think there is maybe a case to be made. I mean, there's also a case to be made that they see that she was not a person of means, and she didn't have a lot of people around her, savvy people around her, and just said, well, this will be easy to take advantage of. But it's also that they thought, well, this is really interesting, and I can use this. So I don't know. So let's look at another case. So Ryan Flanagan was a healthy 21-year-old student living in London. Like we talked about earlier, like students, he could use some cash. And there's a prescription drug trial advertised on the internet, and it looks good. They offered him $3,500, which again, that's a good chunk of change for anyone, especially a student. And he didn't think there would be problems, and that's what his girlfriend told the newspaper. So on the night of March 14th, 3 hours after he took the drug TGN 1412, he was admitted to the hospital. His mother got a call that his head and neck were swelling up and his legs were purple. As of the next day, he was alive but in critical condition. So far, what do you think of the study design?
It's a lot of money.
It might be coercive because that's a good chunk of money.
It's a very serious reaction for only 3 hours after taking the tablet.
That seems,
Surely they've seen this somewhere else.
that seems pretty severe.
And if it's an early phase and it's the first time they're distributing, I think they would have kept him longer.
Kept him longer, gave him a smaller dose. That there's some things that are alarming us here. So he was one of 6 men admitted to the hospital. These were all healthy subjects after suffering severe reactions, and this was a monoclonal antibody, sort of a biologic medication that they're using more and more for things like MS and rheumatoid arthritis. One man's head swelled to 3 times its normal size, causing excruciating pain and leading him to scream that he felt his head would explode, which is terrifying. What do you feel about the study design now?
Because more than one person had the adverse reaction.
Yes.
Why weren't these men hospitalized while they were taking the drug to start with, to watch for these severe reactions? Why are they taking this as an outpatient treatment?
Because, you know, they're healthy. We'll give them $3,500.
Well, and if they're healthy, how do they know if it's going to treat these other things?
I think they're probably just seeing proof of safety. It's what they're looking for, not actually treatment. They're in an earlier phase. They are learning some things about safety, which are not promising.
How do they know they're healthy if they don't do testing? They don't know that they're healthy, they just go by word of mouth, I guess.
I don't know. I mean, it's possible that they tested them. That is info we do not have.
Said a large population was given this drug, and as everybody knows, there are thousands of people allergic to penicillin that don't know they're allergic to it till they have their first anaphylactic reaction.
So it's different if he was one of 6 men out of 6 or 6 men out of 1,000. No? Would that make a difference for people?
Well, I know that one was one out of 6.
Huh?
So I knew about this story before. It's just a very small population.
Right. It turns out that it's very small and they all are terrible.
You would think that in their if they had done proper preclinical studies, that they would have seen some of these potentials and done a
This
lot
is a
more.
very severe reaction in a large number of their subjects. So you think this cannot be total news to you, which leads you to believe, kind of like Jesse Gelsinger, there's information they had that they did not share.
And some sort of scratch test or something to see if the person would react to.
Or that how did they arrive at their dosages or things like that. So more than a month after the incident, doctors are not sure if these adverse events, his swelling of his legs, are reversible, especially for the patient Ryan Wilson, who is the lone person still hospitalized a month later. He slipped into a coma for 3 weeks after taking the drug. And after awakening, he found that he might lose some of his fingers and toes, which had turned black, gone necrotic. I'm told it's like frostbite, and my fingers will just fall off. In addition to being in a coma for nearly a month, he also had heart, liver, kidney failure, sepsis, pneumonia, and dry gangrene. In general, sounds like a super miserable experience. What would you have changed about this design? Anything? Everything.
Sounds like they didn't quite inform him of the potential risks and benefits, because his family friends said that he thought, they said I'd be fine, I need the money, so.
Right.
And maybe they didn't do the proper preclinical testing.
They may not have. So something doesn't make sense here. They should have, if so many, because it does turn out, we know it was a small population and they all had really terrible effects. They should have had a heads up. How did they should have used a smaller dose, something like that.
They should have done something like a 3x3 design, so the first 3 you enroll one after the other, not at the same time, and if you have, severe adverse reactions and of this level, then you stop, you don't keep giving this drug out.
Do you think he should be compensated for his injuries?
Yes.
What if he signed a consent form? That's a. Why? I hear everyone say yes.
I don't think he consented to that.
They didn't do their due diligence. I don't know where they didn't do it, but they did not do their due diligence.
Okay. Anyone disagree? Want to cause trouble? No. All right. I'll move along since our time's ticking down. So the role of the institution, of course, the IRB is here to protect the safety of research subjects, good research design. We need to look at if this is research. We talked earlier about research as contributing to generalizable knowledge. It's different than a one-off or an emergency use. Are human subjects involved? That is not as clear-cut as you think, because there's times that you can be using humans, but it's not seen as human subjects research. We might not be collecting identifiable information, things like that.
If you're using medical devices, it's considered a human subject if it's just their tissue.
That too. Is the research protocol flawed or scientifically pointless? We've determined we're not going to be looking at the effect of large quantities of vodka on dogs. What level of risk does it pose? And of course, a bunch of our cases have gone back to this. We can never know for sure. We should have some idea based on our animal model tests, things like that. Both Jesse Gelsinger and this Brian Flanagan case suggest that it did not pose an acceptable level of risk, and for some reason that was either not known or not conveyed, and that seems to be some troubling research protocol. Will subjects be adequately informed and consent obtained? Of course, if they're not, we do not have a good ethical study. There's times you can waive consent, but it's generally minimal risk. You're not, it's maybe a survey study that getting personal information from consent form would actually be more arduous than not. It has no more risk than normal life. Are the subjects to be recruited unduly vulnerable or singled out? And so we've talked a lot about that. We want to include a variety of people, but include them in a responsible way. Are there adequate provisions for monitoring data? And of course, how we monitor depends on the risk level of the study. And have suitable protections for maintaining the respect, dignity, privacy, and confidentiality be employed. So those are all things that the IRB is going to look at when reviewing your study. Also, are you complying with the acceptable regulations, both federal regulations and the regulations of the institution? Are you following the written procedures? Are you documenting the specific requirements by the IRB? And the IRB is going to have continuing review of your protocols to make sure things are going smoothly, that you're reporting your data safely. If you have a lot of adverse events that we can talk about, is this just because these patients have cancer and have complicated medical histories, or is it because there's something that really needs to be changed in your protocol? So let's take one more case. Dr. Q, a neuroscientist, is involved in a study using a newly developed scanner to see if she can identify neural states that correspond to depression and suicidal ideation. So each scan and the questionnaire and interview takes 2 hours to complete, and then there's a follow-up scan after they get the initial results. So that the follow-up takes an hour. So she's going to offer $300 in compensation for all of this. She's going to recruit from general patient populations at VA and UAMS, and is going to hang up flyers in PRI. How does this recruitment procedure look to you? Legit? Troubling?
Troubling, targeting a vulnerable population to begin with, instead of the general public.
Okay. Can we ever target a vulnerable population?
If I need to study suicidality, we're gonna have to study the list suicidality.
Other thoughts? Agree, disagree? Is it fair to just study a depressed patient cohort?
Have to at some point, yeah.
I mean, I think it's fair that we need to look at this as a vulnerable population, but if we want to learn about this population, we need to do some research with them. Other thoughts about the recruitment procedure? How does that amount of money look to you?
It's hard to say, there's 2 hours and 2 scans, and you have to be here twice.
But in the population-based hospitalized?
I
So it's
don't,
not like they're
I
going
don't think
to
they're
work.
hospitalized.
They're just. Then what would
It
the
says
flyers
just
in the
general-
Psychiatric Institute do?
General patient areas, I think, are not hospitalized, but they have treatment at like outpatient.
Right, I mean, they might come see their psychologist or psychiatrist for their depression and say, oh. Other thoughts? All right.
Since it is a vulnerable population, you do have to take care of the consent process and informing.
So it sounds like we're on the fence at the moment. We're not convinced it's right or wrong. Yes. We're concerned that it's a vulnerable population. The money amount seems okay, but maybe we could use some more information. So it's decided that the informed consent is not going to mention the specific mental states they're looking to identify, since that might influence the results. Is that acceptable omission?
I think it sounds fun.
Okay, see, 2 no's and 2 yeses. Awesome. All right. I hear you saying it's okay.
I can see how they might say that that could skew the results. I mean, they're looking at what does your brain look like when you're depressed or suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they want to know all different ways that your brain could look. And, the power of suggestion, if they say, I'm going to be looking at your brain to see if it shows some happiness or some whatever, I don't know what all they could look for, but I mean, that could potentially skew the result.
Okay. Now, one of the people who said no, are you willing to share something?
I just feel like if a person is seeing a psychiatrist because they're depressed, they know they're depressed.
Mm-hmm.
So why would you want to leave that out?
You should be able to tell them everything that they're,
Mhm.
what this study is about, regardless of what mental state they may be in.
Okay.
If I can send somebody for a suicide, research, I mean, I'm gonna tell them it's because we think you may be, not in those words, but, so.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's probably not news to them that they're depressed. Other thoughts?
You could certainly do this and screen for suicidality in your eligibility criteria, or have something like, some things have what is that test called, the mental.
Mindy, mental status?
Mental status,
Yeah.
or something else that would be a tool to be able to make sure that they were eligible and did indeed have these criteria without giving it away, but take extra care in what you're doing.
All right, so we have some disagreement about if they need to be told we're studying depression and we're looking at you because you're depressed versus we're scanning people's brains. So it turns out that Dr. Q has her research assistant do the informed consent, and it's discovered after that about 50 participants have not been scanned and interviewed, and about 1/3 of the forms are not signed and dated properly by the participant or the interviewer. Would you exclude that data from the results? Why?
It's not done correctly, you can't, maybe the patients weren't informed all the way, but you have checks and balances, everything has to be checked off. It's not done, I mean, if
All right, so we don't know if they were informed when they gave consent.
It's not documented, it didn't happen.
That's what I was trying to say.
So, at minimum, the consent, those that do not have a signed agreement consent form should be excluded at minimum.
That doesn't tell us exactly what the problems are, and we see all sorts of problems in consent form documentation.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a date discrepancy, and we can kind of figure it out, or if the problems are explained in a consent process note. you
So it
can
might be that-
more favorably. If there's no consent form signed, then that's a much bigger issue.
Maybe I'm just confused and think it's April 13th and I date things wrong.
Right.
Okay.
Maybe it just turned January 1st of 2015.
Oh, isn't that the worst?
I agree with that.
Okay.
If you do not have a signed consent form for that participant, that data should be excluded. If it's a date discrepancy, you're gonna go back and investigate it and figure out what was wrong with it, and that would be a decision after you've gone through some, to figure out what's happened. That would make a difference.
All right, I can go through this one really fast. After a year, a review of the research reveals some protocol violations, including not only the consent problems that we've talked about, but the fact that some of the participants were scanned but not interviewed, some were interviewed but not scanned. Someone alerts the newspaper and they run an article talking about the protocol violations, but also they disclose, oh, this is looking at depression and suicidal ideation. So then participants start to call Dr. Q and say, well, what did my scans show? You know, did you learn something about my depression or my suicidal ideation? And one family is upset that a family member who was in the study did commit suicide. Do you think anything went wrong here?
This is sloppy research.
Okay, in what way?
Some were interviewed but not scanned, but not interviewed. I mean, you gotta follow the process.
They're not following the protocol well. Their study staff is not doing things in a uniform way. So now they're coming back to this issue of, you know, if a patient finds out what they were studying, the patient might say, you weren't honest with me. I don't trust research at UAMS anymore. I just thought I was participating so you could learn about a new scanner. And also by not telling patients, they haven't clearly set up the expectation of what results will be returned to the family. Like, this is an important thing to talk to patients about so that they don't enroll to get medical information about themselves, to tell them, you know, you're enrolling for research where this is not for your own personal medical care. If they didn't mention that here, people will say, well, I'm here for my results. So part of having the good consent form is to set up the expectations for everyone. I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time, so we're just about at time. Thank you for being good audience, good participating. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me, email me, and have a good day.